Good morning. Would you please stand for a moment of silence, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance? Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, at this time we have one public input card. Mr. Stuart Klatt from the LCEA.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to address you briefly here. I read an interesting article this weekend that there is no teacher shortage. Just because I cannot buy a Mercedes for $1.98 does not mean that there's an automobile shortage. There's a shortage in how we take care of our teachers, how we take care of the working conditions, how the respect that we give them in the classroom, their pay, their benefits. In fact, in Lake County, we've had about 400 teachers since June resign. So there's a shortage, but not in having qualified teachers. There's a shortage in all of the ancillary issues that we need to take care of. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And other than that, I think I sent you some information about speech and language therapists. And I'm sorry it's upside down, but go home, put it on your Google machine and rotate it. Thank you very much for the opportunity this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, we have another card that just handed in, Mr. Yoakum. Dr. Tibbetts, you're going to get me in trouble.
Good morning. Vance Yoakum, I write the blog fiscalrangers.com. I just wanted to comment on looking here. You had a very well-detailed budget update that was in the package, and I really appreciated it. It actually showed one year to another. It showed percentage changes, and of course, based upon that, I bring up the thing that I bring up every year is that the benefits and all the benefits and the insurance and everything else are drastically increasing. It's shown more than what the 3% economy is, or even if you take Trump's record of 4%. And my thought is that you need to start passing these costs on to the employees. Okay, you went out several years ago and you set up these medical facilities for people to go for free, and that was supposed to be the solution to this, and it apparently isn't happening. I would like to see maybe a better analysis or a workshop presentation to go through all the details related towards the different components of this. Some of it I realize could be that there was the legislature and even the federal government is catching on to the fact that a lot of promised benefits to retirees are not being funded, and they are starting to require that they show up on the financial statements, and I know that's happened 2 different years in the past. And I would like to see you protect the interests of the taxpayer by having a more detailed analysis of this, and then ask why this keeps going up. And if it goes up, it ought to be passed on to more percentage should be passed on to the employees. I mean, I worked in corporations where if you had an increase in your costs of 1% in some areas, they'd have to lay people off, okay? And and what we found also is that in 2 different corporations, if we passed on at least 10% of the total health insurance costs to the employee, they started asking questions. They started asking questions of their doctor about, well, what is this? Why can't I get a generic drug? But when you don't have a big percent, they don't ask those questions. And so, and there also should be some programs probably for wellness to deal with people who have various they're smokers or whatever, and that they need to be put on a program. And I worked in companies that did that. And so that's what I would encourage you, because as a taxpayer, every time that you just arbitrarily put these increases on the top and say, oh, well, we just got to pass it through, that's coming out of your expenses, the funds that you've got for other issues. And that's what I'd encourage you to do, is to be aggressive this year and get that information out in the open and ask the staff what they're doing to reduce that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our first topic of the morning is the growth planning updates and projections. Let me introduce them. Kelly Randall and Coordinator Growth Planning. I don't know if you want to do that.
You ready for me to dive in? Superintendent,
Go ahead.
Board Chair, Board members, thank you for this opportunity to talk about growth in Lake County and where we see our planning process going from here. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Helen LaValle. She's the other senior planner in our growth planning department. Helen does concurrency management and development tracking. So if you have any questions about particular developments, she's really the person to go to, not me. So before we go on to where we think that we're going to go from here, we look at where we've been. So last year's projections, as you know, we look at 40th day to 40th day. We look at the projections for all the traditional schools. Those are Lake County owned and run schools and the conversion charter schools. We do not necessarily project for other charter, non-conversion charters, and obviously private schools or any of those other programs. So where were we at? In October of 2017, we were looking at 18,330 elementary school students. This year, in October of 2018, we had 18,605, a difference of 275. Our projection was that we actually thought that we would be up by 255. We were 20 off on that. On the middle schools, we were off by, we thought we'd have a difference of 130. We actually were at 97 additional students. Where we were really off was at the high schools, although I would say that's a pretty small percentage statistically speaking. We thought we would have 164 additional, and we were actually at 253. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we look at individual projections coming in. I will say our demographic work is by Deanna Newman of Public Pathways. Y'all are familiar with her, and she wasn't able to be here today. So if there are technical questions, highly technical questions about the demographics, I'm going to have to refer those to the expert and come back to you with the answers on them. But I will do my best. I know just enough to be dangerous. We actually do track the enrollment at the non-conversion charter schools just to see if we see any major changes. They can affect our enrollment. And so what we've seen is that the charters that we've had for a while have remained fairly stable. The only change really has been that Pinecrest Lakes Academy, obviously in Mineola, has grown and will continue to grow for the next couple of years. Once they go fully out to K-8, then that will just work into our trend. And so we'll just roll that over, and we'll probably see some stability there. And again, these are actual enrollment numbers as of the 40th day, which usually occurs somewhere in October. So this is where we get into the technical part of it. Demographic analysis consists of a whole bunch of things. We use a fairly standard cohort analysis, which means that we follow kids from birth all the way through their public school years. But there are some influences that can affect Lake County in particular. But first, we're going to look at the birth data and how that builds into our projections. So this is where it gets pretty technical, and I'm not going to explain each of these numbers. But basically what happens is that the kindergartners from 2013 obviously became the first graders from 2014, and they keep going on from there. we have a natural assumption of growth, and then we actually look at in-migration, which is students who are moving into Lake County, and that actually is where our growth comes from. One of the things that you'll see, oh, sorry, I'm gonna go back there, I went too fast, is that we actually look at the outgoing 5th grade and then look at the incoming kindergarten. So you'll see that in 2017, we had an outgoing 5th grade of 3,068 students. And again, these are actual numbers. And then we had an incoming kindergarten in 2018 of slightly lower. So we always look at those numbers to kind of see. And you'll see especially in the high schools where that's been affecting us. But we also had a fairly large, oh, I don't know why that circle didn't go. We had a fairly large 5th grade in 2018 of 3378. I'm sorry, this is actually this year, 2018-19. And so that is not being replaced by a large element or a large kindergarten. So it'll be a couple of years actually before we see a kindergarten that will then kind of equalize the size of the 5th grade that's outgoing. It's going to be, we're going to have some large 5th grades outgoing and then some smaller kindergartens coming in. So that's going to play into our overall elementary projection numbers. These are the births and how it goes into kindergarten. So then the birth column that you see there is actually about 5 years before the kindergarten number. So I'm going to look at it, particularly the births or the column for 2014. I'm sorry, the row for 2014. So those births of 3193 are actually from 2008. And you can see that's the first year that the number of births drops fairly significantly. And considering looking back at 2008, you can see why that would be. The recession, the birth numbers dropped, and they've actually stayed fairly low, as you can see, until about 2 or 3 years ago. And so this past year was the first year that we really saw a much larger birth number that equaled the number before the recession. And so when we look at the percentage, then that plays into a number of students who are entering kindergarten. Through the blue column, or the blue rows, through 2018, those are actual numbers entering kindergarten. But then we look at the percent, from then on it's projections. And we look at the percentage, if it's going back to, say, 2012, 0.85%, that's basically our base number. We don't consider that a growth year. That's a fairly stable year. There's always going to be a certain number of students who don't enter kindergarten from that birth cohort for whatever reason. From then on, it's anything above that is basically considered a growth year. So we look at our middle school years, and basically they are fairly stable. We had projected to 19, and we're not quite there. In the high schools, in the high schools, one of the things that we wanted to note was that our 9th grade number in 2018 was actually pretty high, and we think that that's probably a better migration from 8th to 9th grade than we generally see, and also that we may have, the higher numbers, we may have seen some retention of Puerto Rican students and retention of 12th graders. I think some of the efforts that the district is putting into increasing our graduation rate are probably playing into those higher high school numbers as well. So hopefully we'll see that continue. We want to talk a little bit about housing starts and the development review that we do. I know that there's been concern that, we are not necessarily keeping up with the housing numbers that are going in. And I will say one of the things about school concurrency, we've been in school concurrency for about 8-10 years now, and one of the benefits to the district is that it provides us with very good information. Our local government partners have been trained and are pretty good for the most part about providing us with development information every time, they see a change, every time something comes in, and they're also very good about providing us with building permit information and certificate of occupancy information. So, we all see the development that's building. There's new subdivisions. It feels like every day you go through someplace. The Daily Commercial has been particularly good about covering development, especially in the Leesburg area. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you may see in the paper and the differences. So if you have something like this first headline, Leesburg to mull over 1,200 new homes in Terra Oaks, they are in the very early stages of development. In this particular case, we've been receiving notices on this from the city. They're in their rezoning and comprehensive plan amendment process. That is the very first stage of development. So it's a long time before we actually get to houses in that particular situation. The second one, subdivision being built along US 27 in Leesburg, you can see from their picture that they're clearing land, and so that one is much closer, obviously, to development. But the good news is that we actually had that development, and we've been tracking it since they started the process. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is for planning purposes, or for those of us who are planners. Basically, this is the development process, and for a standard single-family subdivision that has to go through the annexation, comprehensive plan amendment, and rezoning process all the way to building, it can be 2 years easily, and that's in a best-case scenario. That means that everything has moved along quickly, they have all the infrastructure, they can go forward very quickly. There's several steps. The school district gets information at each one of those steps, and we have the opportunity to comment at each one of those steps. So if they submit an annexation, a comp plan amendment, and a rezoning, then Helen's going to respond with what we call an adequate public facilities review. And basically that takes a quick look at the schools in that area and lets them know whether we have capacity issues, whether we see anything that they need to be concerned about. They'll follow that up with a preliminary plat, which is a general subdivision layout. And at that point, then we tell them a school concurrency review is required. Or if it's a subdivision that had already gone through the process before the school concurrency was implemented, then we would tell them it's exempt or move forward from there. They also then have to do a construction plan. Again, we get that information. And for us, that's more a note that that's a real subdivision, that they're going to start moving forward, that they're going to start construction. But again, there's a time period that occurs where they have to build that infrastructure before they can actually start building any houses. So that is, I think, it's the point where we do school concurrency review, and they have to either have a capacity reservation or they'll have to enter proportionate share mitigation. But at the same time, that tells us, okay, here's our timing now for when that's going to come in. And then just technically, they go through a final plat, and then they have to submit for building permits for each individual house. And again, our local governments give us that information as we go through. So that helps us a lot with the timing issues. And really, for me, I've been with the district for 12 years. I was here before they implemented school concurrency. And the biggest benefit to school concurrency is really the information flow between us and the local governments. I think that before, when we were really having a lot of growth concerns and a lot of development pressures, we didn't have that structure in place. And so that structure is here now. And there's very little, I think, really that takes us by surprise. Not to say that it couldn't happen, but our local governments really have been very good about communicating. Multifamily apartments are definitely faster. They don't have to go through quite as many processes. They don't have to do construction plans. They'll do what's called a site plan, and that is really their one technical step that they have to go through until they get to building permits. So they can be a little bit faster. We are seeing more apartments. We have 2 that were in review in Tavares area. It's the Atwater Apartments up there. I'm not sure what road that's on. It's behind the hospital. And then there's another one, I think that the Lake Saunders Apartments in Tavares as well, which might be the one that you're thinking of, Mr.
There's a subdivision.
There's one going in just past, on Old 441 as you go, or Alfred as you're going out of Tavares before you get to the industrial park down there.
Grandview,
It could be.
Yeah.
we have that.
Okay.
Lake Dora, the Dora Landings.
Yeah, they'll change names sometimes, so that's one of the things is that we have to go back and make sure in our database that we have all the name tracking because, you know, they can change names 5 or 6 times sometimes
times.
between the original application and the final sign that goes out. So we also track building activity. We get both building permit numbers and we get certificates of occupancy. You can see that since 2011, there's been a significant increase, but it has been fairly stable for the last couple of years. Not all of our cities have provided us with information for 2018. We're still waiting on 1 or 2, so that number will probably go up a little bit, but not a whole lot. We provided the chart below just for fun to show you kind of where it's at. I don't think there's any real surprises there. Claremont, Groveland, Tavares, and then Lake County. And because Lake County, of course, is all of Lake County, we went ahead and provided a division. So obviously the biggest growth area is still the South County. But surprisingly, Tavares, the Golden Triangle area, is definitely increasing their development, and then Leesburg has a little bit of a share in it as well. And this is just kind of a fun density thing that shows you really where the development is. I don't think there's any major surprises there. So what are the things that we're seeing? We're seeing that there are more apartment projects designed for families, and we are actually in the process of working on a new student generation rate that will be part of our impact fee update. And so we'll see whether there are actually any changes there. One of the things that we saw the last time we did an impact fee update was that our multifamily student generation rate increased slightly. And so we'll see whether that continues or whether there's a change. That can frequently be an economic function. You know, as single-family housing becomes more expensive, the more families will stay in apartments for longer. And so that's one of the reasons why they're building more multifamily and apartment projects that are designed for families and have more bedrooms, basically. We are seeing increasing housing activity throughout the county, really. It's been pretty diffuse, but it's still concentrated largely in the South County and then in Tavares, Sorrento, Mount Dora area, some in Leesburg. We are also seeing continued build out in the Four Corners area. That's the area around Sawgrass Bay where we're planning our new school. And also north of that, between the developed area of Claremont and the Four Corners area, we are really starting to see that pick up. We have had multiple projects come in. We had a meeting the other day with the developer for that area. And so I think, you know, it's been quite a while, but I think that area is really going to start to pick up, and we'll be tracking that very closely. And then one of the other things that we are seeing is that prior to the development when the building activity was so fast and heavy, there were quite a few developments that had been entitled at that point, and so we're starting to see developers come back and pick those up and come back through the process and build there. So fortunately, we had those numbers were kind of background information, and as that timing comes in, then we move them forward, and they go through our tracking system as active developments at that point.
The subdivision on the west side of Grassy Lake that's being built out now,
Ardmore Reserve.
how many homes are estimated there?
Do you have that number right offhand?
Off the top of my head, I don't have that, but the phase 4, 5, and 6 was approximately 600 units itself.
And they're mainly family homes?
Single-family homes, yes.
So there's a lot of development that we're tracking in Mineola. The hills of Mineola, they were actually entitled to some degree before the recession hit. Obviously, they've been on hold. They had told us quite a while ago that they anticipated having model homes in when the Turnpike interchange opened. Obviously, that hasn't happened. I drive through there pretty much every day on my way to work. It's been, pretty slow development. Helen is receiving the information. I think they're at preliminary plat
The Hills of
for some
Mineola?
of the pods.
Yes.
So, it'll probably still be another couple of years before that development really starts to take off as well. They don't have construction plan approval yet. Mr. Mathias, did you have a question?
I just want to focus on that one for a second because we've had some discussions. And with their plan, and it's pretty much on track with what you're saying, they're saying 3 to 4 years is when they will be in full, I guess.
Yes.
And we have 30 odd acres that were part of the deal
Right.
for us to do a public school. So how would I begin to see where that's going to fit as we move forward?
So those numbers are not necessarily in our enrollment projections yet because they are not at construction plan review process and they're not, they're probably still a year at least, and probably more out. They are not in our end enrollment projections. As they get closer to the process, they'll go into the enrollment projections. That is, like we said, one of those areas that we're tracking and that we're looking at. And when I talked about the capital plan last summer, sorry, my voice is starting to go. When I talked about the capital plan last summer, one of the things that I talked about was that if the Tavares Pinecrest, I apologize to everybody. The Tavares Pinecrest Charter School opens, then that funding that's available at the end of that 5-year period would probably be moved back to a school in that area. So we're looking at it. We'll keep monitoring it. I can't tell you right now when I think that those funds are going to be available for that.
But
school.
in the scenario, and Dick Jurgen, who is the developer, and he recognizes that a Lake County premium school will draw to for his development. When you sit with him and he says, I need a school, we're going to be populated in 4 years, let's say. How do we give them that assurance, or can we, that we are good partners with him?
Well, I would say that there's 2 factors that are important here. One is the timing of their development and when that builds out. Our student generation rate is about 328. I was going to say 329. I was close. So it's about 3 students for every 10 houses, really. So it takes a while. They have about 4,000 units, I think, total for the Hills of Mineola. That takes a long time to build. So even if they are building and they're building fairly quickly, it's still going to take a while to get to full build out at the 1,200 students, 1,300 students that they will generate entirely. So timing is one of the things that we need to look at. And the other thing, obviously, is funding. So funding probably even more than anything being the most important part of that.
But when you have a developer who's willing to have a conversation about prepaying impact fees, that how do we, instead of just talking, if this happens, if we said, if you break ground on this day, that we're going to be able to support your development with a public school, because the charter schools can say that. I mean, they've already said it. So how can we say it and then perform?
Well, I think that's part of the capital planning process. I mean, you need to be able to commit, he needs to be able to commit that he will prepay those impact fees.
But if it benefits him, you know what I mean? So to lay that out where it's completely transparent for both he and the district, that I'm just trying to get to, because
Well, that would be
he
part
is
of a-
calling saying,
Sure, well, that would be
where
part
are
of
you?
a development agreement that we would have to enter with him. If he wants those assurances, then we would need to negotiate a development agreement between the school board and that developer.
And what does that look like? The development agreement? It
It
says
would
that we will
basi-
build on this day.
It basically lays out his expectations and our expectations for him.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. I'd love to see a conversation about prepaying impact fees, because if I think about that area, and I mean, not even thinking about 1,200 kids yet, but what happens when 200 kids are there? I just don't know where they're going to go, right? Because we've got the subdivision building next to Grassy Lake that's, and based on that generation rate, I guess we're talking another 70 kids. I know Pinecrest has got some room, but we can't be, using that as the fallback to say, everybody go to Pinecrest, right? That just can't be our strategy. So thinking about the timeline it takes to build a school, if we wait till the money is in the bank under normal accumulation of impact fees, I think we're talking, what, another 10 portables or so on the Grassy Lake campus?
We would have to be relying on portables
Yeah.
for a little while.
So this prepay option
I
seems to be the
think
way to
that's-
go.
And we already have the land. The land's already been allocated, the 30 acres.
It
So-
has. We do not actually own it.
It's been allocated, though.
It has been allocated. It's in a agreement with the developer when it was Family Dynamics, that they would give us that land. Right. So we have a commitment from them. We don't actually have.
No, because the
So
commitment is,
dedicated
if
land.
we can't perform, then they need to have student stations, and they're gonna look somewhere else. And it would be hard, even with the agreement, because we've gone back and forth about that, for us to deny kids student stations for the sake of this agreement that says we own it, but we can't figure out if we're gonna build it.
Right. Well, I think that's a discussion that we need to have with that developer. And really the form is a development agreement that basically says we will do X, Y, and Z, and you will do X, Y,
Well,
and
I've
Z.
met with him twice, so however we need to formalize it.
I would involve our attorney.
But the agreement, as I recall, and I don't have it in front of me, but I don't believe there's a deadline in it for selecting.
There is
It
not.
merely says that we are entitled to receive additional land if we exercise the option to do so. In concurrency, Kelly was telling you that the big benefit is the information. That's because we really don't get a big benefit on the dollars. The only leverage that we have against any of the developers who aren't already entitled is to get the impact fee timing changed. It's not, we don't get any more money. It's not any different than they would have to pay under the ordinance. It's just when we get the money is the really only advantage we have in the whole deal. So we try to use that as a way to get the developers to come to some agreement. And then you have this last item on that particular slide is also the problem. When we entered into concurrency, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of lots that we didn't have any control over in concurrency. We didn't even have the leverage to be able to make them prepay the impact fees. They were already entitled under previous action they were taking. So, those are going to be coming up for years when you're talking about what do we do with 200 kids. Well, we could easily have 200 just pop up at a development that we don't have any leverage to try to negotiate something different with because they were already entitled 15 years ago.
Well, in the leverage, and I'm not sure where we stand with the impact fee study, but the last study was held as we were coming out of the Great Recession. I feel pretty confident when we get the new numbers, it's going to be higher. And that seems to be a lot of leverage, that if you prepaid now, it could save you millions of dollars on a development like the Hills of Mineola.
Before we implemented the new impact fee.
That's what I've already said that, by the way.
Well, I think that's a discussion that we need to have with that developer and involve our.
But at what step in this process do we give him confidence? And this is a person that truly, genuinely believes that a quality school will drive his development.
Sure.
So he is supportive, but he wants to make sure that we're able to perform.
Okay.
And so when does that formal sit-down take place? Because like I said, I've had two.
I would say the
casual.
sooner the better, for both of us.
So he comes in and sits and meets with you guys.
Right, and I would definitely want Mr. Johnson involved in that as well.
Okay, I'll organize
Yes.
that.
Sounds good.
Okay. So, going back to our projections, some of the other things that we look at as we get, as we go through the process are outside influences. Those can include immigration, which is basically growth, economic indicators, that's the state of the economy, and then obviously the other big thing is charters and other institutions and other programs that might come in. So we want to look at the charter schools and their effect on our traditional and non-conversion charter schools for a minute. So going back to 2017, we looked at Pinecrest Lakes Academy, and really the reason that we put this map in there is to show you that their effect can be fairly diffuse, but it does definitely have a correlation on the location of the school. So Pinecrest Lakes is that star, pretty much right in the middle of that. And you can see from the red dots, which is where the students come from, obviously clusters largely around the school, and then it kind of fuses out. I'm like, is that a word? I do that sometimes. I make up words. I don't know if anybody else does that. So when we look at that basically to inform how that's going, the future charters are going to affect our other schools. And I will be the first person to say that this is an educated guess. So we do not know necessarily what individual parent choices are going to be for their students, but we do our best to make a guess because it does affect our schools, and it affects a lot of things that you'll see, I think, later today. This is the predicted impact of the Seven Lakes Prep Charter, and we have been very clear that we are not 100% sure that that school is going to be built exactly where it is. There have been some litigation issues with their site plan, and they're still working through that. If it looks like they will not be under construction by March, then, we have said that we will go back and look at these numbers and possibly take some of these kids and put them back in our traditional schools. Of course, with charters, I never count them out. They can do like South Lake Imagine did many years ago and open with a kindergarten and storefront for, a year or two. So again, I never count them out, but we always kind of keep an eye on them. So what we do with this is we basically make an educated guess on where we think those students are going to come from and the numbers of those students. Obviously, in this case, the most affected student or schools are Claremont, Grassy Lake, Lost Lake, some to Pine Ridge, some from Mineola Charter, some from Groveland. It's pretty diffuse just because of the location. If you don't know, this is right behind Eastridge Middle School. So it probably could draw from quite a few, and as well, pretty much all of the South County middle schools. So what we do is once we have a general middle school number, and we know the allocation of those middle school students to the middle schools based on trend and the zones, then we draw back and we take these students that we think are going to go to the charter schools out of those individual school enrollment projections.
Excuse me.
Same thing with,
Mark, do you have an update on the school?
It's quite tangled in the legal battle, if I understand it correctly, and
and I don't think that they've come out with any definites on it yet. We try to keep touch with Claremont pretty regularly and ask them if there's been any updates. And
Has there been an injunction filed, or?
I don't believe so. I have not heard.
So since they were approved?
but I don't think they've been able to
Sitting on
close.
They have not, the last I heard was that they have not, the city of Claremont has not approved their site plan. They've done the review, but they have not approved it. So they approved their special exception, which was a zoning issue, but they have not approved the site plan that actually allows them to start construction.
I think there's some major drainage issues in their proposed site plan. So
About 5 acres.
Mhm.
So they have to
Gee,
do
I
some
wonder why.
So they have to do some retention?
And they were gonna build it up to be at the height of the backyards of all the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So that, apparently that doesn't work for water flow.
So we'll see, we'll keep an eye on it, and again, like I said, in March, if they, are not under construction on that site, then we probably will revise our individual school enrollment projections to bring those students back to our schools for the most part. And this is obviously.
Really small school.
Well,
Why are we
it's,
projecting such low numbers?
so we actually project them a little bit low because of course there's some growth that will just come in. It won't be a necessarily a, they draw students, first of all, they don't start at 735. They start at a much lower number because they only go K to 6 and they kind of build through there. And even their 4th, 5th, and 6th grades are not full size 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. So that their starting number is much lower. And then we also assume that there will be some students who come out of private school who are not tracked in our numbers, are not in our school projections. And we also assume that there will be some growth that comes in that we don't necessarily have.
Pinecrest only started with 400-something kids, right? So
Right, they generally start much smaller than the 735 that they project to end with.
I know these people are taking applications. They've got it advertised in a million places, but I don't know. I'd find it hard to go apply for school that I haven't even seen any sort of groundbreaking occur yet.
Right, so we tend to be pretty conservative when we do these, but we also don't want to not do this and, completely overproject our individual schools, because that has other implications down the line for open enrollment and for other factors. So again, because of the open enrollment window, we are looking at it very closely in March, and before that window ends, then if we feel like we need to pull those numbers back up because this isn't going to open, then we'll do it then.
But you just hit on something there with the open enrollment, and it will be already closed by the time March comes.
It doesn't end until the end of March.
End of March? Okay,
So it's a 2-month window.
okay.
So that was really our timing in factoring it in March. Pinecrest Four Corners obviously will probably have a much lower or effect on fewer schools just because of the isolation. We also expect a fairly good number or percentage of that enrollment to come from out of county. Polk County, if you've been following their development down there, it's incredible, and Osceola as well. Orange County is starting to pick up, but in Orange County it tends to be a little bit more tourist related than actual residential. But even then it can have some, they'll get students from overseas in the winter, and so it's kind of an interesting demographic thing to look at there. But this is basically our effect. It's Sawgrass Bay. We expect some on Pine Ridge and then some from out of county. So again, that just is to look at our individual effects or our individual guess on what's going to happen when those charter schools come in. We do have the 2, so that explains the negative projection for 2019. We actually think that'll be a fairly big hit on us. And in 2020, we have a small negative projection, but we actually think that will go down when the effects of Pinecrest to Verries, when we see those, because we don't include it until we actually, 1 year out, when we see that it's really going to move forward. And so next year when we do this again, you'll see that projection if that school is actually moving forward. And then pending no more charter schools, we expect the numbers to start going up. Larger kindergarten increases in the later years as the birth rate picks back up, and we may see this increasing even more as some of those housing starts are up. Middle schools, we are projecting, that's our elementary school projections. At the middle schools, we actually are projecting higher than the state forecast. It's kind of a Deanna question. I'm not sure I can tell you exactly why that is, but we do tend to be a little bit more accurate than the state because we can see they do a trend, and we can actually see the effects more quickly in what's actually happening on the ground here. And then in the high schools, one of the things that we are really closely monitoring is that we obviously don't have any charter high schools. So while the state is going to be looking in our COFD numbers, which is capital outlay, FTE, they are looking at that trend. Those students that are coming out of the K-8 charter schools are coming to us for high school. So we actually expect that we will always be a little bit higher than the state's forecast for capital outlay at the high school level, and we do expect growth through the high schools as kind of that demographic shift goes through.
I know high schools are more expensive to build, but what is the reason that we don't have charter high schools?
I think it's largely a factor of cost. They're expensive to build and they're expensive to run.
Think about the programmatic offerings for 200 or 300 kids, and how do you provide a slate of 30 different AP courses that we do, and how do you have all these various
Choices.
Yeah, I mean, the sports and the extracurriculars. It's hard when that's
So they can make more
stuff
money
these
off
students-
of the elementary schools.
Actually, as successful as the Villages Charter School has been, it's always dropped off in high school, the enrollment has, especially the last 2 years, for those exact reasons, the sports and the AP programs and things like that.
So what does this, I think I skipped a slide. So what does this actually mean for our planning process? And when we come back to you with the next capital plan, what are we looking at? So we just, because everybody's kind of familiar with that geographic division, we went ahead and divided this geographically. Leesburg, the Northwest County, we're really not seeing, even though there's been some increased development there, we're really not seeing a lot of pressures. We actually have capacity at all levels, especially at the high school level. Leesburg High School actually has quite a bit of capacity, and we have capacity in the middle schools as well. We do have 2 projects that are coming up there, the Fruitland Park Elementary reconstruction, and that will be largely portable replacement. We'll also have a little bit of additional capacity there. And then the Beverly Shores, I called it portable replacement here, but it's really portable and those old 50s, 60s wing buildings.
When you say portable replacement, that's not putting a new portable in an old one's place.
No,
That's
I'm
building
sorry. It's
just
replacing
for the record out
portables
there.
with permanent construction.
I want to make sure we're straight about Fruitland Park.
Yeah,
Because
I'm
Fruitland
confused about
Park,
Fruitland Park.
we have that 30 acres that we were looking at and building on it in lieu of.
We do,
Right.
we
So
still
why,
have.
so it
why
isn't-
else are we planning?
So why are we planning to replace portables then?
It's not replacing I'm sorry, I should call it, I need another term for it.
Yeah, building a new
It's-
school on the
it's
other property.
permanent- It's replacing portables with permanent capacity, right.
But at a different site in that case.
At that case, that's yet to be determined. We still have not heard from the state on their, on the Castaldi submittals that we put in August. Although I talked to them, I think Friday, and basically they said they have some new processes there, so they are hopeful that they will get some of their backlog.
Well, what's an out then if they don't approve us doing that as far as using that property then for something else that would qualify so that we could still build a new facility on another piece of property?
Creative. We need to be creative, and we'll figure that out once we have notice from the state. You know, there's a couple of possibilities that we could reuse I don't anticipate a problem with getting Castaldi approval on the older buildings at Fruitland Park. I don't think that we will get it on that new building. I'm 100% certain that we won't get it. And so we will need to be creative about what we do, either some way of moving that along or reusing that building, if that's the
I
direction.
thought
that
the
we
issue
wanna
was that it was a bonding thing. Is that right?
Well, there's both. there's the bonding issue, and then there's actually the state's custodial approval issue. It's never simple. So we'll be working on that and moving that forward. We have the funding available in 2020. It's actually closer than that, but I think it's supposed to open in 2024.
So, on Beverly, how many portables does Beverly Shores have?
I'm going to say 10 to 12, maybe, something like that.
So why did we choose Beverly Shores versus like
So they
Treadway?
actually have-
Treadway
so they
has
have-
like 13 or so.
So it's not
portables.
just portables at Beverly Shores, it's also that they have probably another 10 to 12 classrooms in buildings that are from the 1950s or 60s.
Yes.
So wing buildings that are surrounded, when you drive up, it looks really nice, and then once you walk through
Yeah, I know.
the courtyard.
It's like
So,
the
And
movie
this
set.
this follows the commitment we made with the 1/3. and we're
Right,
gonna
and
spend
that's
dollars.
sales tax
I know.
funding, so that was part of what we advertised to the public that we would do. That was priority
What are the
number,
timeline?
well,
Priority.
3 or 4, whether you call Claremont one. So, anyway, that's the next one after Fruitland Park on our priority list. The North County High Schools, Helen comes to me regularly and is very concerned about these because not only are we projected to exceed their actual fish capacity, neither of these schools, Mount Dora High School and Tiberias High School, have any portables. So we are expecting to exceed their fish capacity in the next couple of years, 2021. We have issues with concurrency capacity in that area. The high schools that we're able to use for concurrency are Umatilla, Tiberias, Mount Dora, and Eustis, and we are running out of concurrency capacity. Basically, we have capacity at Leesburg, and we will be adding capacity at Lake Mineola, although Helen tells me we're going to run out of that one relatively quickly too. But we can't do those because there are concurrency service areas between the Golden Triangle and those other available capacity. So we look at that area of and if we don't have any projects for mitigation, then basically we are stopping development, which is not, I think, good for any of us. So we will be looking at projects. One of the options is to add what we're calling permanent portables. It's basically portables that we purchase, and we have to provide covered walkway. There's one or two other contingencies in the interlocal agreement that allows them to act as concurrency capacity. So we would be reliant on those until we can come up with a longer-term solution, which is basically doing some options to attract students to programs where we do have capacity and trying to balance that capacity through that area. But our short-term project or solution really is to add permanent portables, probably to Mount Dora High School as much as anywhere else, because they are a growing area and they'll need both kinds of capacity.
Is a permanent portable one of those modular units, or is it a portable that we're just calling permanent?
It's basically a portable that we call, it's a paper term. It's a portable. It's gonna look like a portable. The ones at Cypress Ridge, for a reference point, are considered permanent portables because basically we own those. They are connected to the main campus through covered walkways, and we have every intention of using those for 20 years or more.
Yeah, the other advantage of that is you can actually put them together where a regular portable, you've got to separate and have so much space in between because of fire code and everything.
Right.
So that's the advantage of that. But I know Tiberias High School this year was at capacity and having to look at having portables brought in, and there's only a place there where the football field is, where they were in construction, that they were able to put portables. And I think they only had 2 or 3 there at that time.
Right. Mr. Carr and I had a conversation on Friday about that, about some possible locations.
So where would we be looking at trying to put portables at Mount Dora High? Or
So
permanent portables at Mount Dora High?
So there's an area, there's actually an existing covered walkway between the auditorium and the weight room. And so
On the-
that's where we're looking at.
Be on
putting
the
them.
south side.
Right. That'd
Gotcha.
probably be the least expensive place
Yeah.
to put them.
Why aren't we considering the modular units? Like they put in at, Round Lake?
They're more expensive, they're,
But we were planning on them being there for 20 years.
right. We can look at them, they're a little bit more difficult to put in, and they provide more capacity probably than we need right away, depending on how we build it. So the benefit of putting in portables is that, we can put in a couple, and in a couple of years, we can come in and we can put in a couple more as we need it, instead of one big expense at one point, at one time. So we can look at both options, certainly. We're not ruling that one out. In the South County high schools, we have our Lake Mineola High School Edition programmed. That will, adjusting for growth in that area, we are expecting to have about 364 seats. That means that some of them will be taken up by growth in the Lake Mineola High School area, but otherwise those will be open for relieving the other high schools. The only problem is they're not going to fully relieve them, and so we will still be reliant on portables in that area for a while. We have, if you refer back to the timeline, we have tentatively programmed a new high school for around 2030, and so one of the things I'd really like to start looking at is buying a new, acquiring in whatever way, a site for a new high school south of Eastridge area, basically.
Why couldn't we use the 100 acres at Sullivan Road?
It is probably too far north to really relieve the area that we need. So a lot of our growth in that area is going to be in south of Eastridge. So it'll be the Wellness Way and Four Corners area. And so really that's where we're going to need our next high school, I think.
Now, in that South County area, Wellness Way area, would we not also need elementary and middle capacity at that point?
Yeah, but
So-
those are a little bit easier to get. So those are ones that we'll be having discussions with. I don't know that a middle school is going to be quite as urgent. We won't be needing to add elementary schools, but we can have those discussions with the developers as they come through.
Well, I guess the long-term plan is that on the K-8 site down in Four Corners we have now, that eventually we put a one
And,
K-5 and 6-8 there, so that
and a middle
that
school,
would create
right.
some capacity.
Right, or convert that K-8
Right,
to a
right.
middle
Either
school
way.
and then build an elementary school.
Yeah.
And the elementary schools, we've already had discussion with one developer about it, and so those are a little bit easier to get at 15 acres than a high school site at 60 to 80 acres.
I'm
Okay,
sorry, I
so-
thought the elementary had went up to 20 acres and 30 acres for middle school.
It's up to 20 acres if we have to do all of our retention, all of our on-site stacking, everything. It can be a little bit smaller if we can kind of combine those infrastructure needs with the development around it.
Okay.
And when do we expect the Lake Mineola High School to open? The
The
expansion?
addition?
Yeah.
I think probably, I'm trying to think.
2023, isn't it?
2020. No, it should be
23.
sooner than that,
Sooner?
2020, 2021. It'll depend on the timing of construction. I know that they're trying to get a design CM going quickly.
Well, the other concern I would have would be Windy Hill.
Well, Windy Hill will be relieved by the Four Corners K-8 because, as we talked about, there's about 700 of their students are down in the Four Corners area. So they'll be relieved through that, and then actually the additional capacity at the charter schools is relieving them as well.
Okay.
Okay, but, so as an action item for our next capital plan, then really funding for a high school site is probably going to be an important one. And then looking at the East Central, the Golden Triangle area, we have the Tavares Pinecrest Charter that's projected to open next year. And so that will probably have an effect and hopefully a relieving effect on some of our elementary schools in that area. Tavares Elementary, Eustis Heights, Treadway, Eustis Triangle are the ones that we expect. along with Tavares Middle School and Eustis Middle School. We are seeing growth throughout the Golden Triangle area. We expect as the Wekiva Parkway is built out, we've started to see some development coming in the Sorrento, eastern Mount Dora area. So we'll be tracking that pretty closely. We think that, once the Wekiva Parkway goes and is open fully, then we probably will see faster growth in that area. And so we're looking at the Sorrento Elementary School. There's a possibility for a 10 classroom addition. We tentatively have it programmed for 2028, and we may need to consider moving that forward if the funds become available, or if we can negotiate, prepayment. If concurrency causes prepayment of impact fees, we'll be looking at moving that forward. And then Eustis Elementary School after Beverly Shores is our next project on our priority list. And so we need to start doing some preparation for that. And one of the items that is remaining is purchasing, there's 2 adjacent lots that we have not purchased yet. And so we would need to look at purchasing those, and so funding for that as well.
On the Sorrento, as I recall this year, they were almost maxed out this year.
They are pretty close to full, yeah. So, and like I said, we expect them to keep growing. We may need to end up putting some portables there, but we'll kind of keep looking at that and see how the Pinecrest Tavares project affects that. But we'll definitely be looking at them, and I anticipate that addition kind of coming close sooner rather than later, really. So our next steps, we will continue to do our jobs and monitor development. We work closely with our local governments. We meet with the planners from the local governments every quarter. And as well, I know Helen is in constant communication with them. And we'll start developing our next capital plan for 2020, 2025. Hardly seems possible. And then these are some of our issues. We're going to identify the funding sources for the action items that we went over, including those portables, the permanent portables, and what you may end up seeing is that it'll actually be a budget item, or a project in that, so that then there's something that if we do end up triggering high school concurrency in the North County, then there's something for the developers to mitigate against. That site acquisition for the new South County High School, and property acquisition at Eustis.
Can we see the cost differential for the modulars versus portable units? Like these new permanent portables, do the kids not, like in the current portables, in bad storms, the kids will leave the portable? Does the permanent portables solve that problem?
No, they're basically the same portables that we use.
So-
It's a paper term for permanent portables.
Okay, so there's that problem of them having to move in a storm, and that doesn't even have to be that bad of a storm. And there's also just the fact that if we're not building, at least, I think, to standards that the charters are building to, we aren't necessarily very competitive if we're like Portable City everywhere,
We can certainly look at that.
Okay.
We will. Are there any other questions?
Where are we with a resolution about the SREF?
There was one thing we were going to figure out which of the elements, it's kind of a catch-22. You've got to know what the elements are that you can use before you can move on them. Somebody's got to provide evidence or testimony about it. And you really kind of need that before you can go forward with the resolution.
What I thought was we had to identify the schools that we were going to build specifically.
Maybe
And
you
then-
identify the specific things you're going to save money on it, as I recall.
So where are we with it? Is that you, John?
Yes,
It's-
partly. What we have,
Please. I know your voice carries, but it'd be best if,
And while he's coming, just little bit about where we are with that is we do have a draft resolution. That's one of the things that has to happen, has to come to the board. We did send it over to Steve. We wanted him to look at the legislation, so this would be something new for us. And so soon, we should be bringing the resolution to you. I think we have decided that the elements that we want to ask that we not have to build to in regards to SRF would be the size portion of that. Everything else will remain the same. So I think we're just a matter of getting with you to decide if we're ready to go ahead and bring you the resolution. This would be specifically for the Four Corners K-8. This is a school that we've identified for this, and you do have to do it by the legislation. You have to do it per school. So we'd have to bring it back to you each time we wanted to take advantage of those flexibilities. So I think we're about ready as soon as,
We can have it the next meeting.
yeah, we can.
Well, yeah, but couldn't we do, of our priorities, the Fruitland Park and the Four Corners? Because we also have to have emergency management agreed.
We've got, that aspect is, we've handled that.
Okay.
So,
Well,
That was
before we start,
specific-
I'm sorry.
That was specific to the Four Corners. We haven't been back to them with any other of the other projects. We're kind of going to get the first one done, kind of going through the process. There's other pieces that we still have to comply with, like there's a cost analysis that has to be done, and there's some safety and security factors that have to be considered, that have to be put into the resolution that we haven't completed yet.
But it dramatically could change the cost as we're looking at our capital plan and how we're allocating dollars.
That is the goal, yes.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, but you almost need to know that we can do, this one doesn't have to be SRF, so we're looking at it one way before we get started, right?
Well, it'll still be according to SREF, but we'll be able to get some relief with regard to square footage. So,
The SRF has two components. One is the
Yes.
Florida Building Code, which we're not relieved from.
there you go, and I wanted to make that, and you
And
just
the
did, that's
other
what I was going, yes, sir.
is the size.
That is
And the
correct.
size is what we're dealing with.
Yes, sir.
I mean, just so
Thanks for
everybody's
that
kind of clear
clarification.
with.
that's what
Right.
I was gonna ask,
We
like,
still have to build to the Florida Building Code.
Yes, sir.
Which is one component of SRF. And then the size is a separate, which is what we're trying to get relief from.
okay. And by
Appreciate that.
not building to the size component of SRAP, we're saying that
Why
this
we
school
save
is not
money.
a shelter. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's why we have to have emergency management clearance.
Right.
So that we have enough shelters. Okay.
So we'll bring back to you something to look at one way or the other next meeting.
Well, as we're going through the selection for construction management, which is coming up at the end of the month.
Yes, sir.
It seems like we'd want to know what the heck we're designing.
Well, what we've done is when we had the bid orientation, it was announced that potentially we have that as an option, so that the bidders were challenged to bring forth a plan that would be cost beneficial to the district and in compliance with the building code, as you pointed out. So those will be reviewed right now. It's scheduled to be on the 26th, as you know.
But again, knowing that architects get paid by their time, that if we are saying to them, we want you to design for SREF over here, size, and SREF over here, not sized, we're going to have a cost of not using one of the plans, one or the other.
That could be significant.
And it could be significant with architects. So I think we ought to have a decision about that. Go ahead and select, I'm not saying slow anything down, but we as a board ought to make a decision about the SREF part, so we're designing one time.
Can you clarify, like, I don't know the law well enough. The size, like, what are we reducing in size? The classroom size?
There's the classroom size, there's media size, right?
Yes, sir.
You go ahead.
Well, that's the classroom. Basically, we can look at it per function. Actually, what we're using it for. So, as Mr. Mathias has pointed out, classroom size, media center. We can look at recreation facilities, how we're doing that, parking lots. There's a little bit of what we can do, there with regard to overflow parking lots, et cetera.
It's pretty significant.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Okay, I got another one. I got two more.
Oh.
So I want to address the Pinecrest Four Corners, and this is Mr. Dodd's district, so I'm going to acquiesce in 10 seconds if you, but it seemed, I just want to say one last time that with our site, literally a stone's throw from the Four Corners Pinecrest site, it seems like we would collaborate with them and let them do either a K-5 or we wouldn't be competing with a K-8 and a K-8. That just, the downsize is, and when you look at your numbers, 309 kids are going to get relief, right, from these schools. So are you saying that there's going to be a whole bunch more that are going to go to
There is quite a bit of development coming into that area.
But they have capacity of 700 and something kids, which they're going to reach. And we have the opportunity to pick up if we need extra capacity, middle school or whatever. I'm just saying that I don't think we've given enough thought to collaborating with them on where we need student stations. But a K-8 and a K-8, where we have to provide all these services and they can cherry pick the students, is a recipe for disaster. I just want to say that. So on the record, and that's all, and then y'all can go on. But, so I'll go to my next one. Eustis Elementary. Why in the world are we still messing with this Eustis Elementary when we have property at Eustis Heights that we could build brand new, and we're trying to put lipstick on a pig, in my opinion, about that one. And that's Stephanie's district, so I'm also going to be quiet about that. I just want that on the record.
Well,
That would be a huge elementary.
Well, I've spoken to Ms. Randall about that, and I'm with you. Putting more money, trying to buy those two pieces of property could be astronomical because the guy knows we want it.
They're landlocked.
And he went and started renovation on his property as soon as he found out things were being bought up. But I think, like you, we go in, we build an extra wing or whatever we need at Eustis Heights, but also look at building something at Seminole Springs to help alleviate some of that growth that would be at Eustis Elementary that could go that way versus go to Eustis Heights. So it wouldn't be a big, overwhelming inflow of students there just from that school only. So, and then look at, as far as that goes as well, is rezoning some of that so that it would be designated as Seminole Springs. But I personally don't want to put any more money into that piece of property because unless you're able to go in and tear down a lot of that and build back like you should, you're wasting money. So I don't think we're treating the taxpayers correctly.
So that's one of the things that we've been looking at is that, there's some other options that are available there, and I think we'll be exploring those before we come back to you with the next capital. There's no funding for it right now, and so I think there's some time. But this is the time because it will be rolling into the capital plan in the
But I
next
do
couple of
think
years.
that looking at in this particular case, the will of the board, for 6 years I've sat here as we've been trying to buy up property around that Eustis Elementary, and for 6 years it has made no sense to me. That's all.
I think there's a historic, love of that school.
That's it.
That is I think the driving factor.
There's a lot of things I love that I got to let go.
And we've had that discussion, and so weren't sure what your position would be on that today, but just know that was one of the things we'll bring back to you. I think for me, before we go down that road, I think I'd like to start some conversation with the people that are there and, just talk to the faculty and begin talking to parents about what this might look like in the future, rather than, them hear it in the street or something that we're considering that. And so that was my reservation today of really going down that road was I just felt like we owed it to them to start some conversation. So.
That I'm sucking it all back in. I did not say anything.
No, I think it's fine because it gives us some direction about because that we've heard that is where your thinking is, and I think that's where our thinking was. But I think that I would like to begin that conversation. I'll certainly do that earlier than probably I had anticipated, and go ahead and start those conversations, maybe some parent meetings and such to talk about those options when we know a little bit more. And of course, it'll have huge impact on capacity at Eustis Heights, and I think Sorrento was actually where we were looking to move the other portion of those students.
And there's also some possibility the core capacity at Triangle is sufficient. There's definitely a lot of different options, and one of the other things at Eustis Elementary is that we did build a building there with 8 classrooms back in 2001, I want to say. So, there's some questions there about how we would reuse that, whether we would be able to reuse that. So definitely, there's a lot of options, a lot of possibilities, and I think a lot of discussion to be had. But there's this is the right time to have it because we haven't committed funding to anything yet.
Well, to add to a question that Mr. Mathias brought up earlier about Fruitland Park would be also, that would go to that as well. I thought at one time in our discussion about Fruitland Park and the existing building that would possibly not be approved by Castaldi to demolish or for us to be able to vacate that property to go, was that because we owed a bond on it, therefore, because of that, that would legally say that we could not do that. But if we were to have the finances available to go and take care of that bond, just like if we still have a bond on the Eustis Elementary, if we were able to go and take care of that bond, would that not free us from that?
So it may take care of the bond issue, it doesn't necessarily take care of the state's, state approval issue. So,
Okay.
you know, those are things that we need to explore and figure out. And, you know, there aren't a lot of, our fellow districts that have kind of dealt with how do you dispose of a property that has a relatively new building on it?
Orange County has like all of their, like every school is built after 1980. So surely other counties have encountered something similar to this. That was my understanding from talking to another board member. So like, how can they have every school built after 1980 and we can't get rid of, like, we can't move one school?
So they're not disposing of their sites. That's really where it comes in, is that they reuse those properties when they, you know, are moving schools or if they're consolidating schools. They reuse them for other purposes. They're not
So
saying.
what are the other purposes that they can be reused for? Like,
Alternative education, pre-K center, I mean, there's ancillary facilities, there's other uses, but, you know, Orange County yet has not been, okay, well, we're gonna sell this property, but it has a relatively new.
how old is
facility.
Rhines?
Oh, Rhymes is.
Old.
Yeah, 1950s.
So is the whole school, like, could part of that facility be reused at Fruitland Park?
The only thing that I know that was the newest thing over there would be the media center. And everything else
Rhine's.
was pre-existing.
Yeah.
The beauty of moving Fruitland Park happens to be its location on the 4-lane highway of 468.
Right.
So from a commercial land value, it would be
We'd be
to
able
our
to get some money
advantage
back.
to sell that piece.
Right.
And safety and
But
security
if
too.
we can't sell it, isn't it still our advantage to rebuild
I
Fruitland
think we
Park
need to be
at the new
creative because
location?
but I think, well, Rhymes is actually, they love their little school. And
I
it's in
know.
pretty good shape.
My mom worked there.
Yeah, so I don't know that those folks would necessarily want to move, but you guys just need to be creative. And okay, so I've been trying to Google it without being stupid, and all I'm coming up with a ghastly. What does Gestalt mean?
Oh, Castaldi.
Castaldi.
It's
Oh, that'd be part of it.
Castaldi.
I was spelling it with a G.
And it's actually named after a person. And basically what it is it's a study that we do that basically says that it is more cost-effective to rebuild or replace a facility or a building than it is to renovate it. And so the state, when we want to raise a building, or AZE, raise a building, then basically we have to request the state's approval through the Castaldi process to do that.
And he was a really bright person, I guess.
He was very smart, very good at mathematics.
I think the idea is that we've adequately, like, used the building
Yeah.
and the
To its
taxpayers'
fullness.
money to its full extent.
That's exactly what it is, really. They've just been very conservative with their approvals.
But for those of us that are local, that when you really analyze it and you say that Gastaldi, we just Gestalled it and we're going to move, we can't, I mean, what's the problem with that? Like, we're the ones that really know, not Tallahassee.
And there's been a lot of discussion. I actually made Helen go to a conference, a workshop, and listen in for me because the state was doing a presentation on Castaldi analysis. And she said they didn't even get halfway through their presentation because all the other districts were so frustrated by their responses to the Castaldi studies that have been submitted.
Do they take into consideration the resale value of the property?
Not necessarily, no. No, it's
So that's probably
basically
what
a cost benefit to replace or raise, or renovate or replace.
But as long as we didn't raise that building, we left that particular building there, we could still go and build on the other piece of property. It's just we would utilize that building for something else until they would allow us to, sell the property with the building as is, or raise it at that time and then sell the property at a later time. But we could still go and build somewhere else.
Well, that's why I was wondering about Rhymes, because they have, part of their property is being used by the foundation.
Right, and they
We
need,
actually own, so the piece that Mr. Matthias was referring to, we actually own 20 acres, about a mile south of the existing Fruitland Park site on the corner of Olive and Urick. And it's actually, it's a nice site.
I know
for
the
an
city wants
elementary
to
school.
build there. Would the city of Fruitland Park would rather us build at the new site.
But we replace a school within a community versus on 468.
Right.
Which I think there's some life safety, security issues. The playground's completely open to four-lane traffic.
So it's just creativity, but we have to get the response from the state, really is our first step.
So we're waiting on a no, basically.
We're waiting on a yes on the older buildings. We know we're gonna get a no on the new building. And then,
So how do we get what we want? How do we work around it?
we're still working on how to work around it.
all right. Anyone else have any other questions?
All right,
Thank you.
thank you.
Does anyone need a break? While we're making a transition from one to the other, we'll take about a 5-minute break. All right, we'll resume and move to 3.02, the budget updates and 2019-2020 forecasting by Scott Ward, our Chief Financial Officer.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Want to give a little bit of an update this morning about the current year budget, and then move into some of the preliminary conversations about next year's budget. So this slide here is a comparison of the third calculation to the second calculation. As you're aware, we typically use the second calculation to develop our budget, and that's prior to the opening of the school. Once the schools open up, we get actual enrollments, and we report those enrollments in FTE to the Department of Education. They take our numbers along with all of the other counties, and they redistribute all of the funding based on growth, not only in our county, but statewide. And you can see that we grew our unweighted FTE, and this is the district as a whole, grew 571 unweighted FTE, and which equated to 677 weighted FTE. So in the basic student allocation, the BSA multiplied by the DCD, the weighted FTE, and that's an additional $2.7 million. Each of the other details in the FEFP are increased based on the increased number of students. A couple of things to note, you'll see the DJJ supplement. That was where we estimated the opening of the one DJJ school, which my understanding is they're still in talks of doing that. Hadn't actually opened yet. But that won't matter. By the fourth calc, they'll remove that $6,000 if they don't open, if there's no FTE. But we still had to estimate that in case if it did open. The other issue is the teacher classroom supply assistant does not get adjusted. It's a fixed amount. And so with the adjustment of the FTE and FEFP, we did not see an increase in teacher classroom supply assistance. So the total FEFP for the district went up $4 million. There's some adjustments in there. One's the prior year adjustment, which is mainly the adjustment on how much growth we had in our school taxable value. And then the McKay scholarships of $3.5 million are reduced in the third calc. We budgeted $3.5 million, so we'll have to take an additional $75,000 out of our current budget to cover that difference. And that grows every year, so it's kind of hard to really pinpoint what it's going to be. And then you'll see the increase for class size reduction of $529,000, and then the discretionary lottery school recognition funding of $27,000. So total state funding to the district increased $4.6 million. So of that, increase. The 677 students of the FTE, that doesn't account for how much there was growth in the charter schools, and there's some other issues. Let me catch up with my notes here, sorry. So, charter schools accounted for 391.15, or 58% of that growth. So, as the charter schools grow, we have to forward the money to them also. Get on the right screen. And of the $4.6 million increase in state funds, $2.4 million will go to the charter schools. One of the other issues that we're having to adjust for currently is the insurance fund. As you know, the funds are set, the contributions are set around this point in time of the year. They go through the negotiation process, and then they go through the process of board approval. And then once they're approved, we pass that on to our employees, and the board portions built into the budget. The original 2018-19 contribution had been calculated prior to the additional contribution made at the end of 2017-18, so we needed to make an adjustment for those additional claims that occurred last year. We also, while we were doing that, had the actuary go and look at what they thought for the current year. We saw some large increases in our claims last October, higher than normal. So with that, we are projecting, or he is projecting, or they are projecting, a $5.4 million loss based on the current contributions that were in the budget. What we have done to mitigate against that is we went ahead and increased that to a dollar amount to catch up between now and June 30th. We did that in the general fund. We also did that in the federal funds and food service funds. So each fund's paying for the increase. We also passed on that information to the charter schools that participate in our health insurance. So they'll have to budget for that increase too between now and June 30th.
Just a second, Scott.
Yes, sir.
That 5.4, that's including the charter schools
Yes,
as
sir.
well?
That's including
Okay.
charter schools, federal, and everything. Yes, ma'am.
You said that of the 4 million to about 2.5 million was going to the charters. How did that? I mean, what were half of those kids charter kids?
We're talking about the growth on the FEFP. Yes, because the FEF, the majority, 58% of our growth was at charter school level.
Okay.
So they get 58 or around 50% of the
Okay.
or half of the increase. So, okay. Now we're back on insurance. Any questions about insurance? We are moving forward. We have a subcommittee planning on meeting later on this week to look at pharmacy. According to our consultant, pharmacy is one of the things that the expenses are outrunning the trends. The trend increase is about 12% for pharmacy, and ours is even higher than that. So we're looking at some different plans, some different alternatives, and of course we'll bring them back to the insurance committee, which will make a recommendation to.
On the pharmacy, that's the one that, not that the clinic provides, but that's the outside?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know what that was.
That actually should be the heat going on.
Once he-
Yeah, polar vortex.
So just.
On camera, you'll see all the freeze. It was just switched over to heat free.
So just to recap, we had a $4.6 million increase, and of that, 2.3 goes to the charter schools for their portion of the increase, and then a $3.9 million adjustment for insurance, and this is the impact to the general fund only. So that's the portion that counts for the general fund. And then we also had an additional adjustment for insurance participation. When we budget as if everybody's going to take the insurance. And because we don't have the actual enrollment yet, we haven't gone through the insurance enrollment period yet. So at this time, we're increasing the cost, but there's also some offset for those who elected not to take the insurance. So it does mitigate against some of that increase in cost. So as you can see overall, we have about a $40,000 impact from these items to our budget. So next, we're going to talk about some of the 2019-20 budget issues, and I apologize in advance for if this looks kind of choppy, because I did most of this analysis based on the legislative request from DOE, which happened last October. And on Friday afternoon, we received the governor's budget, so I had to go back and incorporate some of the governor's budget. So if it sounds kind of choppy, the reason why is because we had some last-minute changes to get the government's stuff in there. So the legislative budget request, and this is for our Department of Education. It was prepared September 2018. It was prepared under a former Commissioner of Education. Due to the changing governor, Commissioner of Education, and legislative leadership, not a good predictor for next year's budget. And it's considered the maximum level of funding for next year's budget. So the reason why it holds value is I doubt very seriously we'll receive funding in excess of this budget, because typically what DOE asks for hasn't been received in a number of years. So we felt like it was at least worthy to look at to get a maximum for next year. It holds the required local effort to the 2018-19 rate, which is very important. We'll talk about that later. It increases the base student allocations by $118 per student, which would give us a base student allocation of $4,323. It increased Safe Schools $100 million, transportation by $75 million, and mental health by an additional $10 million. It leaves the sparsity supplement, teacher classroom supplies, reading, and digital classrooms allocations the same, so there's no adjustment for growth in these categories. It cuts virtual education contribution by 53%. And one of the key things that's important to us is it eliminates the total funds compression allocation, which would be about $2.5 million for our district. And then all other FEFP allocations were just adjusted for growth. So no increase in the per student amount, but just growth. Of the $578 million increase to the FEFP, approximately $88 million of that is growth. The rest of that is what they considered enhancement. Of that $578 million increase, $420 million of the increase is holding the RLE at the current rate, and then the remaining $158 million increases provided through the state funding. And the reason why that's important is to note is that if they do as they have in the last couple of years, the majority of that increase being the holding the RLE at the current rate. If they don't hold the RLE at the current rate, they won't have the funds to increase what they have in their budget.
Excuse me, Scott.
Yes, sir.
Let me go back to the eliminates the compression allocation.
Yes, sir.
This is from the Florida Department of Education,
Yes, sir.
right?
Yes,
Not
sir.
the legislation.
No, sir.
Okay.
None of these, what we're talking about today, the legislation has not met yet, so none of these issues have been in front of the legislation at this point in time.
Why would the Florida Department of Education want to eliminate the compression?
They feel like that they should roll it into their FEFP formula because they think that their FEFP formula is more fair and consistent.
Okay, but it's not.
I agree. Especially to us.
This is another thing. We just need to tell the state you're wrong about that.
I understand.
And Gastaldi said it.
I completely agree. It's not fair.
So
Yes, ma'am.
the 420.8 million is assuming that they roll back?
Assuming that they do not roll back the rate, if they leave it at the current rate. So if we get to continue to levy our required local effort at the rate that we're levying it this year, statewide, you would see an additional $420 million.
But in the last 3 years, they've rolled it back.
Correct.
So
And
we would not get that 420.
And that's why I consider this budget a complete maximum level, because I don't believe that they will fund it at this rate at this point in time. And then just felt like it was mentioning about the PICO dollars. It holds the allocation for remodeling, renovation, maintenance, repair, and site improvements at $50 million, which is the current year allocation. It increases the allocation for the charter schools, $10 million to $155.5 million. And that increase is based on the new Florida statute requirement that the district share a capital outlay millage if the state funds appropriate for charter schools are less than the funds per unweighted FTE during 2018-19 adjusted by the CPI. So they've increased the number of students and they increased for the CPI, and that's the reason why they added $10 million of PICO funding to the charter schools, so that in hopes that they would not have to receive any of our local capital outlay funding. Except for the 3 special facility projects, no PICO allocations are proposed for new K-12 school construction. And just as a side note, the state has not issued any new construction dollars from any of its construction dollar funding for new schools, with the exception of K-12 special facilities since 2010. So they're not funding new construction except for the special facilities.
What's considered a special facility?
In your in your smaller school districts that could not raise enough funding through local sources to ever build a school, your real small rural areas, the state will step in. If there's a specific need for a school, they will step in and build the school for them. It's usually about a $40 to $50 million appropriation each year, and it's usually over a 3-year period. So they usually roll 3 projects each year.
Thank you.
Friday afternoon, we received information about the governor's budget. The governor does roll back the required local effort on existing property. It allows for increase on the new property, which is very similar to what they did in the current year. It added $50 million to Safe Schools, which was half of what DOE asked for. It subtracted that $50 million from digital learning, which is very important to our district. And it added $10 million to mental health. It also removed the funding compression and includes $423 million for best and brightest teachers and principals. And I put that in red. And the reason why I put that in red is because that was funded at a smaller amount in a separate appropriation last year. But what they have done is they've rolled that up into the FEFP. So when the legislators use the FEFP number, bottom line of how much they're funding per student, you have to understand that they're rolling in something that they funded somewhere else into that number this year. And it's one of the tricks that they've used in the past to help inflate that number for what they provide to school K-12 education.
This is a lot more too, right? Like, what was it last year?
It was a little over $200 million last year.
So
I think
they doubled it again.
I think it was like 200. I'm shooting from the memory, so it was over 200,000. Oh, excuse me, 200 million, but it wasn't the 423. So it is a significant increase in that program, Best and Brightest.
So that line on our legislative priorities about reappropriating that money, that's probably not going to happen.
Well, they've moved it up, but they haven't discussed yet what they're going to use that money for. So the governor did announce when he announced this budget that he wants to continue the Best and Brightest, but he wants to change some of the requirements, and he hasn't really discussed that yet. Right. I think he plans on doing that in the upcoming week or two. So, but remember, this is the governor's request to the legislators. Sure. And, in the past few years, although different governor, different legislation, it really hasn't carried a lot of weight with what the legislators finally do. So, but it felt like worth mentioning here.
Is this Best and Brightest, is that what there was a lawsuit about?
Yes.
Yes.
What was
it? What's scheduled to go to trial? I'm just making a note to check this week.
So we're going to double the amount we allocated. Something's being litigated. Brilliant.
All the smaller districts are out of the lawsuit for all intents and purposes.
Out of the lawsuit, but they're still debating
what they do with the money and how they do with it, but whether or not they can do it is what's being debated.
So if they can't, where's the that's being allocated back into our?
It's determined that it's discriminatory in its practice and to stop. I'm not sure what they're going to do with the $423 million.
So $200 million is being litigated, and they're going to add another $200 million.
And roll it up into the FA.
That would make up all the lost funding from exempting 65 And you're old folks from paying school taxes, right?
I don't know.
This is good.
We'll see.
How would you make that up?
They said it would have, they wanted it structured to where it wouldn't have an impact on the school district. I don't know how it would. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think it really, because I think one of the provisions was you had to live in the same house for 23 years or something. And mostly what we have here are snowbirds that are
There was some talk about that. Okay, we ready to go to the
still
next?
goofy.
So we actually get to, with the governor's request, they actually sent our individual district information, so I felt like it was worthy of going over. And so next year, they're projecting in our district increase of 456 unweighted FTE or 482 weighted FTE. The new required local effort reduction, we would levy for required local effort 3.9 based on this. And then the BSA would go up $50 per student. So that with the BSA and the DCD, if it stayed the same, we would have about $4.3 million additional.
That doesn't, does that even go with inflation? Like what
No.
percentage? Okay, no.
And that 4.3 million also, of course, we're expecting growth in charter schools, right? With potentially 1 or 2 new schools coming on board.
Yes.
Obviously, that's going to be, so that's going to eat up like pretty much all of that.
Yes. I agree. Yes, sir.
Okay.
So the detail of.
Looking for the good news here.
And this is the most optimistic.
That's right.
This is the middle of the road. We'll see. This is the governor's budget, not the DOE budget. DOE's was most optimistic. This
Oh,
is
the
kind of-
DOE was more
Yes.
optimistic.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Yes,
Great, great.
So this, in the detail, the discretionary compression would go up. We would see a $643,000 increase in safe schools. As you can see, the other ones would go up for some growth and adjustment. Not sure why our instructional materials actually went down a little bit, but then the virtual education would get cut. And then the digital classroom allocation, distance learning, they renamed that distance learning, so I'm not quite sure if they're going to change that program, but you can see, we would see a $750,000 cut in the digital classrooms.
Isn't it where we're largely paying out of this Chromebook initiative?
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to mention that because that will definitely impact us rolling out our Chromebooks, and that's what's impacting us the most about this budget.
Yeah.
Is that was our major funding source for Chromebooks. And I was going to mention that. That's in my notes to mention, so glad you picked up on it.
Well,
before I got
gosh, you
there.
could use all that extra money you're getting from instructional materials to compensate, right? Oh, whoops, that's cut down too.
Correct. So then they had some label in there of additional allocation. It doesn't discuss at all what that additional allocation is for. I don't know if they just used that to put the difference in their budget, but we would get $140,000 additional allocation with no real direction as to what to spend that on at this point in time. And then the best and the brightest would be $6.3 million based on their current allocation. And then we would lose the total funds compression allocation of $2.8 million.
Okay, this is terrible.
So total FEFP would be up 8.5 million. And then, of course, we would have the McKay Scholarship adjustment in there. The class size reduction would go up 478,000. So total state funding would be up 7 million. And then that just shows the total required local effort and the discretionary taxes from the 0.784 mils. So some budgetary impacts that we do know a little bit more about right now. This is not in the governor's budget or the DOE's budget, but we know that based on the projections for next year that we're going to see an increase in school taxable value, in the increase to employee health insurance. We have the numbers, the actuarial numbers for the increase for FRS. We are working on an audit adjustment for the FEFP, the change to the FEFP formula, any potential changes there, and then changes in legislation. So the school taxable value on December the 11th, the ad valorem estimating conference predicted a 7.1 increase for Lake County Schools taxable value. Of course, this will change before the actual budget is done, but this kind of gives us an idea of what they're expecting. The increase will not impact the funds received through the FEFP formula because the BSA determines that, and it gets leveled across the state. We will not see an increase to the state average for unweighted FTE, therefore it will not impact the amount received from our discretionary millage. As you know, our discretionary millage is less than half of what the rest of the state is, so it's compressed, so it's still in our FEFP formula. It will increase our estimated revenue, $2.3 million for local capital outlay. So our 1.5 mills will bring us an additional $2.3 million. And then about an $800,000 increase for the voter-approved millage. So we'll be able to increase that budget a little bit for next year. The insurance fund, it's the same slide I showed earlier. And here they also, based on the roll-in 12, they have the next year's numbers at this point in time. And you'll see there's 48 million projected for the 18-19 year. And then there's 50.6 million for the 19-20 year. So it does show a little over a $2 million increase for next year. We will probably update those numbers as we're going through this process, but we know that next year our insurance contributions will have to go up.
I think you and I had talked at some point about doing some sort of analysis on the return on investment for the clinics. Like, have you guys looked at that at all? Like, on whether
we are having
helping
conversations with our consultant, and he has some ideas, some discussions. There are some things that we can do, but we'll go through the insurance committee and have those conversations. There's been conversation about when you go to the clinic, a lot of the drugs are free, and we're paying for those free drugs. But there are other programs like Publix that offer free drugs too that we wouldn't have to pay for. So there's some idea about having some of those drugs that the employee or the patient would go to those programs to pick those up instead of getting them free from the clinic. But that's a conversation that needs to be had because the downside to that is the clinic won't really be able to track the patients using the drugs. So some conversation we're going to have about some of those items. But right now our consultant is he's saying that where we're beating our trend at is in our pharmacy. So we need to look at pharmacy.
That's our biggest goal.
This is the blended proposed statutory rates for the 2019-20 the Florida retirement system. These rates are actuarially determined. They were released in December. They have been presented to the legislation as a bill. The legislation typically will go in and approve those rates to continue the funding. The good news is that there's not a significant increase in these. The employer rate will be increased to 8.47 for regular, 14.58 for the drop participants. And the dollar amounts for those, if they were in effect today, the general fund would see about a $384,000 increase. Food service would see about a $12,000. Federal would see about a $30,000. The other, so about a $430,000 increase to the district as a whole for increasing the Florida retirement system next year. We received a FTE audit in 2018 of the 2015-16 year. The Auditor General comes in. They look at what we reported. They look at our practices. They look at our documentation, and then they make recommendations to the Department of Education based on the results of that audit. And they typically recommend that they take back the FTE funding that they had provided us. And in the FEFP portion, which is the student FTE portion alone, from that audit, it was $511,000, and the transportation audit adjustment was $103,000. A lot of the transportation audit adjustment is a result of the student If you have a student that is reported with a 254, 255, an ESE student, and they qualify for ESE busing, if the state removes the funding for the FEFP for them being a 254, 255, then you also lose the transportation funding for that too. So it's not all necessarily related to transportation not reporting accurate numbers. A lot of it has to do with the changes in the student.
Why would that change, though? Why would, you said the state would do that?
Yes.
That they would change it?
Well, the Auditor General calculates it when they're doing the audit, but a lot of that change in that calculation for transportation is based on the change to the student side. So it's not necessarily because transportation didn't do a good job or didn't report something. It could just be because the auditor took it out of the student side, and because they took it out of the student side, they also take it from the transportation side too.
Are these, wait, is this money we owe or money, this is money we owe?
So what they will do is they will adjust our future FEFP formula for this. So what they'll do is typically they'll take it out of the subsequent year. So they audit 1 year, they go through the appeal process the next year, and then the following year they'll remove the funds. So we are currently in the appeal process now. We filed an appeal on several of the items that the Auditor General had noted in there. We're hopeful that we will get a lot of this overturned. Also, of the $511,000, a portion of that is to the charter schools, Ali Charter School being the majority one. They did not wish to appeal their student finding, and we've already recovered those funds from Ali. So a portion of that's already going to be sitting in the fund for next year that we've recovered from the charter school.
Okay. Well, does that mean that Ali is not reporting properly?
They had an issue with their time that they had with their students, and they were assuming that some of the time that they were not at their school, the students were still working from home. It had something to do with their busing schedule and how they were trying to run 2 shifts, an early and a late. And so they were picking up the students. They were picking up the late students as they were dropping off the early students. And so it didn't give them enough classroom time. So the Auditor General adjusted down their FTE based on the actual time that they were at the school versus what they had reported.
Is this recent with Ali?
Yes, sir.
It is?
Well, it
it's
was.
Because a
it was-
couple of years ago, we had
right?
like a $900,000 exposure.
That was a different issue. Yes, sir.
Seems like they need some help.
But this is 2015.
Yeah, the 15, 16 year, but it was audited in 2018.
Okay.
So there have been other years since that audit that they could still come in and.
Well, I believe they're right now they're in our district doing the 17, 18 year.
Right.
So, and I'm not sure how that's going to impact Ali because they were doing the 15, 16 audit in 2018, and I don't know if they had enough time to make a correction or not. So,
And they owed us the $900,000 because they didn't properly keep records on the FTE. That would have been for years before that.
Yes, sir.
Before 15,
And
16.
I thought, I was pretty sure that we were going to try and get all of the conversions all using the same, to make available our software so that everybody was reporting the same. Did we
I
do
don't
that?
believe it
Did we ever
was-
do that? Or
They're not conversion.
they're just a regular charter? Come there, Jerry. And they're reporting. But we were going to make it available to regular charters as well, right? Wasn't that right, Creed?
Yeah, they-
Using our, oh, they are using our system.
But they're just using it wrong.
Brilliant.
Professional development. They need some. Right?
I believe that the issue was their understanding as to what they could count as the time of day that they were serving the students. Even though they were on the bus, getting bussed in, they were assuming that they were taking some time at home and were trying to add that time at home into their day of instruction.
So do we know if they've resolved the issue? Like, it's been 3 years, right?
Yes, when I discussed this with them a couple of months ago, they said yes, after the audit, they changed their busing schedule. So now they go out, they actually run an additional bus route. They go and pick up the second shift students go and drop them off, and then pick up the students that are first shift and take them home. So that was enough to shift enough time back into their day to be able to count both shifts.
But they're likely to have this, like they fixed it this year, so they're likely to have this show up on the next two audits.
They yeah, this may be in their 17-18 audit. We'd have to go look and see. But in their 18-19 year, it would not be. They have corrected their 18-19 year.
But they elected not to appeal, and you captured the dollars.
Yes, sir.
Does it make any sense that we would be proactive and look at it ahead of being audited? So if there's dollars that we need to be held?
Well, the good news is the auditor has provided the selection of schools, and Lee's not one of them.
Oh, good. Okay.
But we will follow up with Lee to see what they did during the 17-18 year. I wasn't here, so I'm not familiar with when the auditor actually brought it to their attention that they didn't have enough time.
Thank you.
And then the unknown
No,
changes,
no.
obviously, the legislative decision, because it really is up to the legislation on deciding on what they're going to do with the required local effort. Are they going to roll it back? Are they going to partially roll it back? Are they going to leave it level? We would definitely prefer that they leave it level for the upcoming year. The potential changes to DCD, there was I believe it was the House last year that initiated a study. They set aside $100,000 to look at the DCD across the state. We are one of the districts that actually is hurt by the DCD. It's not as significant, but we are hurt. There are other districts that fare very well from that, and they're usually the ones that are larger school districts that have more House and Senate people on their side. So we'll see how that falls out.
Well, there was actually something in the paper here about a week or so ago, or 2 weeks maybe, about Volusia County
Yes.
being hurt and devastated by
53 districts are hurt, 14 benefit.
Yeah.
that. So,
And then the reappropriation of the total funds compression allocation, which there's been a lot of talk about that. A lot of people want that put back into the FEFP. We would like for them to hold it out for us. I believe there are some legislators who felt like that was a better thing to do last year, and I think hopefully they'll reinstate it again this year. And then the additional funding for security and mental health. DOE asked for $100 million. The governor asked for $50 million, but took it out of our Chromebook fund, for lack of better terms. And then, so we'll see where that goes. But both sides so far have added the $10 million for mental health. And then changes in legislation. The new governor, one of his campaign promises was 80% of the classroom expenditures. Of course, that's been discussed several times, and no one can ever really pin down what a classroom expenditure is. And then there's the Florida Teacher Fair Pay Act, which has been filed, I believe, from both sides, Senate and House, which would establish a $50,000 minimum teacher salary. There is the additional homestead exemption for those over 65, and the impact that would have not only on our FEFP, but also on our 1.5 mil and our voter-approved mil. And then, so far, no companion bill in the Senate, but I felt like it was worthy of mentioning that there is a bill to increase our local capital outlay millage back to 2 mils, which would definitely address a lot of our capital outlay needs in our district. And then the governor's best and brightest teachers and principals, he's moved it into the FEFP. He's mentioned of making some changes, but we really don't know what those changes are yet.
One of the things that was brought up at the Florida FBSA conference was the 80% classroom expenditures, and I think it was Jim Hamilton who commented that I don't know, many years ago, one of the governors came out and said it was going to be a 54% at least I'm not exactly sure of the number, that was mandated to be in the classroom. And after they did the, I guess, Red Book calculations, everybody in the state had that much money in the classroom. So it effectively changed nothing. They just played with the numbers so that, so that's what is expected to happen with that 84%, is that they expect to just manipulate the numbers so that we all have 80% of our money in the classroom.
Mr. Dodd and I had that opportunity. We went back and forth with our prior CFO, and I was given a number, he was given a number, all depends on how you manipulate the number. Is that right? We had a point of questions.
Yes, sir.
I want to go back to the insurance fund,
Yes, sir.
because since you highlighted it twice and Mr. Yocum spoke to it. So, just so I have an understanding, $40 million in claims?
Yes, sir.
So you get down to the
That is projected at this point in time. We're still mid-year, but
But
yes, sir.
that's almost $10,000 per person in the district. And it seems,
No. You're multiplying by kids. But this is.
no, 5,000.
5,000. You did 5,000.
I did 5,000. And so, and if the clinics, the intent was to mitigate some of the cost, then we're spending $5,400,000 pretty consistently, and yet our claims are going up. So there's a real disconnect on this insurance for me, like legit. I mean, I don't know I know that that at one time we looked at our workman's comp had spiked, and you can go through and look at a couple of cases. So do we have a couple of cases that our claim was $40 million? I mean, this is seriously a little bit goofy to me.
Two things that I noted. One, we are seeing a higher trend. The other is mental health. The capitation which is an insurance term that I can't really describe, but basically.
Gestalti.
Exactly.
Has something to do with it. Just like.
In January 1, 2018, the Blue Cross and Blue Shield, which structures our plans, even though we're self-insured, began with mental health. Before, mental health was paid basically by case, by service, whereas capitation basically says when someone enters into the system, you just pay a flat rate. It's almost a sub-insurance within insurance for mental health. They believe that will help them mitigate against the increase in mental health cost. So we've seen about $100,000 increase in that, and we haven't really, per month, and we haven't really seen, we're not really seeing the savings across the board for mental health because of that. So,
But we're self-insured, though.
yes, sir.
right?
We're self-insured. But because of the plan design, they still, because we use their plan structure, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, when they make changes, we essentially pay for those changes through the plan.
How active is because we just changed insurance brokers, right,
Yes, sir.
last year?
Yes, sir.
And so far, I don't see where they're really helping us. Are they really a partner to us in sharing? how to
They are.
Did-
I believe they're being very proactive. Whenever I called about what we need better numbers for 18-19, they came in and had a conversation with us, and they were already rolling the ball for pharmacy because they really think that that's one of the areas that we need to take a good, hard, long look at, because we're running close to the trend on medical with everybody else. We're seeing about the same increase on medical.
So with
but our
5,000
pharmacy
employees,
claim is-
$40 million in claims?
Sir?
5,000 employees?
Yes, sir.
And we spent $40 million on claims?
Well,
That seems,
part of that is our health, our medical, part of that's our capitation, and part of that is our pharmacy, where we're really seeing the increases in pharmacy. So they're being proactive in going out and trying to look at some different plans and some
Wait,
alternatives.
but you have pharmacy as a different chart line.
actually it's showing a credit, though.
That's a rebate.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's-
gotcha. Oh, pharmacy rebates.
Yes,
I
those are rebates.
understand. Oh, you're saying, okay, so you're saying of the 40 million, it has those three, okay,
I
I
mean,
get it.
I'm just curious how much more it would be if we didn't have the clinics, the $5 million worth of clinic.
Good question. I have the same question.
So that also begs the question, if the clinics are being run efficiently, or if resources are allocated appropriately, and I guess just anecdotally, my wife was making an appointment for a clinic the other day, and there were no openings at one clinic, but then all the other clinics had this whole slew of opportunities, and you think, why in the world, in the middle of flu season, do all these people have so many available appointments, but yet this one is just packed? Do we have people in the right places to serve that kind of demand?
Yeah,
Or is that off
they
base?
have been, they've been presenting information to us on utilizations and stuff, and because there are a couple of clinics that are full, there are a couple of clinics that have a little bit of opportunity. So they've done a lot of they've provided a lot of detail on that information to try to show that they are managing where we have the clinics and how they're being used. There has been some conversation, but about expansion, but expanding is we're at the point we can't just extend hours for the doctors. We're going to have to add a whole nother doctor to expand in some of our areas. So they're kind of weighing the cost for those two options.
Right, I guess what I'm getting at, is it possible that some clinics have too many doctors if there are that many openings versus this other clinic is jam-packed full? So the people who, I mean, if you live in Claremont, you're probably not driving to Eustis, right? So.
Especially when you're sick.
Right. So if you're then looking at that, there are a number of people then, because they're not able to get into the clinic that's close to their house, they would then go seek care elsewhere that would come in at a higher rate.
Right.
So.
Part of the problem is that there's only 2 doctors at each site. And because they only work 40 hours a week, to cover the amount of hours, then this doctor may be on duty and this doctor not on duty, and this doctor may be working late and this doctor coming in earlier, that type of scenario. So with only 2 doctors there, that in some cases, in the south end is where they're most heavily hit. And that's why the extra clinic was put down there to try to help some of that. The Leesburg and the Eustis clinic, I mean, there's times that I've went on there and I can't get in. And I'm like, where is there an opening? So you might be 2-3 weeks out because there's so many things that people are there, they filled it up. But I mean, there's only 2 doctors at each location, so if you was to take a doctor away to try to, but the other thing was they were looking at trying to stay open later hours. But to do that, either you pay the doctor overtime or you hire another doctor. So then your increase of costs go up, but yet you're able to hit more of the demand of what you need to do in the locations.
Well, see, that's why I think it would be nice to have like a workshop on the clinics, because I think it's complicated. Are we utilizing physicians' assistants?
No.
But I definitely can go back and request that we set up.
I know that we celebrated as we opened each clinic. I think, what is there, 4 now? It was one when I first came on the board. And it was celebrating access for our troops, and it would be a cost savings to us. It clearly is not a cost savings that I'm seeing here.
Well, he's
So
saying
I
we're
agree.
maintaining trend. So trend is like how much regular insurance
I know.
increases?
Yeah, but if you don't have, like if we're following trends, is that people with trends with clinics?
But-
Or just insurance
I
trends?
agree.
But
Yeah.
so if you take away the $5 million for clinics, it doesn't just necessarily mean that $5 million goes away. That transfers to increased
claims.
at a higher rate, right? That if I'm going to go now to this, somebody else's.
That's the
wellness
theory.
care-
I don't know if we know that, though.
Right.
We don't know
But-
if
but-
we're getting that return on
If-
investment.
And the idea was that it would offer better service to our employees. And I'm kind of hearing that maybe it doesn't. And
No,
that,
it does.
I hear
Yeah.
good things,
Well, it does at times, and then it's overwhelming because you may have an epidemic come in, and so therefore all the clinics are being utilized pretty much.
okay, but since I don't participate in our program, but am I allowed to go to a doctor outside of the clinic? to do
Yes.
that? Okay, well then you just do that. That answers that. If you can't get into the clinic, you go to the regular.
I
If
still
you
go to
can't
my
get-
regular doctor when I feel I need to, because, I trust him. And I trust the doctor I go to at the clinic. But there's only so many things that I think that I would let him go to, that if it's dealing with my heart, I'm going to the doctor I've been going to for years.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't go to
You
the
know.
clinic either.
So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So
How
can we
much
have a
above
workshop
trend
on
are
our
we?
insurance?
Yeah, I'd like a workshop on insurance.
So y'all are meeting this week, correct? The Insurance Committee's meeting, and
Yes.
so I would imagine after they have met, that they'll have this discussion there and bring something back for us.
I would really like to see if we've had some major contributors to the claims. I mean, because it's conceivable you could have somebody give you $1 million,
Yeah.
one person.
And that's exactly it, because if you look at it, 40 million, we're average of what, about 8,000 a person, 9,000?
9,000.
Okay. I don't spend 9,000 at a clinic.
Well, somebody did.
I know, but I mean, and, you know, and I don't spend 9,000 outside, you know, except maybe when I have knee surgery, maybe that was pretty expensive, I don't know, but.
There are a couple of drugs that are out there that one dose is, you know, $100,000. And so, you know, one or two illnesses in the district become very costly. And,
Cancers, yeah.
so
Which
it's-
that would be whether we had the clinic or didn't have the clinic, we would still incur those costs.
And we have to be careful, you know, when we talk about it, because you can't really call out what's wrong or what the medication is, because it's,
How much above trend are we on insurance? Or like, what's trend and what's the insurance?
I wish you wouldn't ask me the numbers. Right now, I don't want to quote them off the top of my head. Let me, I can get that information and get it to you.
And we'll have
Yeah.
a workshop on
We
it.
just know that our pharmacy is higher than what the normal trend is
Okay.
for the industry.
Could,
Yes, sir.
by the time we have the meeting this week, is there a way that we can narrow down how much the pharmacy actually is?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, we have
I
that.
think we buy everything from Canada.
Okay, that was my presentation for budget so far, so if there's any more questions?
Anybody else? I mean, we appreciate this wonderful presentation of giving us all this bad news.
Yes,
Thank you,
for the
Scott.
bad news.
All right. We're at 3:03 now. Allocations, Dr. Emily Weiskopf, Chief of Transformation, not Transportation. Aren't you glad?
Is it really, do you feel like it's getting warmer?
No.
It was
Can we
definitely
turn
not.
it? Yeah, you think?
I think so.
Okay, the heat is blowing on me.
You're not, yeah.
I was going to ask if anyone knew the early signs of frost.
It doesn't feel like it's heat that's blowing on me.
I don't know. I see a lot of folded arms out there.
Just because they're grumpy about the budget.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Dr. Weiskopf. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So thanks for the opportunity to come and give you sort of where we are with the allocation plan. As you know, board policy states that this plan needs to be approved by March 1st, and so we'll workshop it today, then be bringing you a recommendation, hopefully with any changes that you see that need to be made for the next board meeting. So I wanted to just kind of give you an update on where we were. You should have two things in front of you. One is the document itself, the allocation document, and the other is the presentation. So we'll work off kind of both of those. I just wanted to update you on last year. So as you know, last year we made some pretty big revisions to this document. We changed the way we did our allocations, and we just really wanted to create a plan that was consistent and as well as transparent so that people understood how allocations were provided to schools. So we want to continue that goal this year as well. And so last year we made a big change to how we rolled out basic allocations. So I'm just going to remind you of that. We went to enrollment, and you'll see that on page 3. Nothing has changed there. We're trying to kind of live that and see how consistent it was. I do want to give you an update on how we did, because I was very curious to see how we did in terms of predicting allocations. I held back 20 allocations at the district level to accommodate for growth. I ended up giving out 24. 17 were basic. 2 were elementary, 3 in middle, 7 in high school, and then I allocated 7 ESE, which was an area that I needed to kind of worry about. We had some growth in that area and some special needs that I needed to allocate some more allocations for. So that's kind of how that came out. You'll also remember on this page it talked about an additional a PE, art, and music, and a discretionary for every single school. So I'm happy to report that I think you've seen the arts shine this year, thanks to the superintendent's directive to make that happen. And also, I thought you might be wondering how many schools chose to use their discretionary for us CRT, since that was a line item that was eliminated off of the pages following. 14 schools have chosen to use their discretionary as a CRT. So I think it's a nice option for people who want it. Others use it in different ways, science lab teachers, reading resource teachers, but I think they've appreciated having that discretionary to be able to use.
Question.
Yes.
The 14 that are using it that way, do they have assistant principals?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, all of them, yes. All of them, but Rhymes only has one administrator, but they do have a CRT.
Well, the reason I asked that question, because in years past, where this came into question was they were using the CRT as an administrator assistant principal type in control, so.
So I think that, the reason why we put the discretionary in there is that they do have the ability to make some choices based on what their school needs, so it is
Right.
discretionary.
So 6 elementary schools did not use a CRT this year.
What did those schools?
Yeah, they used
choose?
the discretionary for a different allocation, yes, like a science lab teacher or something.
And were they our bigger schools, or
Not necessarily,
so it was just?
but based on choice.
So do you
moving-
think that worked out well?
I think, I do think it worked out well. I think it allowed for people to be able to make some choices, and I think that those allocations have been used more to provide some content coaching. But I think that people use them in different ways still. And remember back in the conversation that we had last year, the position was created to use in various ways. So when you do a little research on that, it's still being used exactly as intended, which was to support administration or teachers in their growth, so.
And so the discretionary allocation, either they're using it as an enrichment position or they're using it as a CRT, or are there other things that they could have possibly used it for?
I guess they could use it for something else. I'm trying to think of somebody who did. But for the most part, I think it's usually an enrichment or it's a CRT, yeah.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I'm Rolodexing.
Okay.
I have a spreadsheet of who used it as one, but I do not have a spreadsheet of actually what they used to, what the others were used for. So.
Yeah.
But I can find out if you want to know. So.
Okay.
So thinking about moving forward recommendations for 2019-20, the committee met a few weeks ago, and with such large changes last year, we really want to kind of leave the document as is as much as we can to let a couple years play out so that we have the opportunity to see what's working. So we only have a few adjustments and recommendations for you today. So the first one you'll notice is on page 7 of your document, and that is there's a place where there are some special schools. And one of those is Rhymes. So I wanted to bring to you a recommendation that we had, and that was to move the Rhymes school to the title to a principal, and mostly for 2 reasons. So I'd like to, if you could just give me some permission to give you some opportunity to explain that. One, when we went out there a few years ago when they had a vacancy, one of the things the staff really wants is consistency. They're a little bit exhausted by the turnover of leaders that comes through there. The staff changes very little in terms of teachers and support staff, but they were frustrated by the turnover because it tended to be used as a place for either growing or kind of a holding place. And so it does create this opportunity as the title of assistant principal. It would be foolish for us to think that somebody would stay and not take advantage of any vacancies that occur for principalships. So just by the nature of the title, it tends to create somebody who's going to look afterwards. So we would like to make that a place where there's some consistency. So that is one of the reasons, just to have some leadership consistency. The other is that their enrollment has grown pretty significantly. We challenge that leader currently that's there to grow that school as much as possible. Currently, they have 294 students. That one was added today. It was 293 as of Friday. They also have 14 more pre-K ESE that will be staffed there this month, which would actually put Rhymes at 308, probably by the end of February, early March. We have other small schools that are allocated with 2 administrators, and this school still operates with 1 administrator. And I think that the idea that this school has grown 26% in the last year and a half, I think it's okay to say that a principal can go there. It doesn't cost us much financially, and it also allows for the leader to be wanting to grow an early literacy program and to really sort of make that their home as well as the staff's home. And so the committee and I talked about it, and we would like to advocate that has a name change to it. So that's our first recommendation.
Can I just get some history real quick?
Yeah.
That 6 years ago, on back, that Rhymes actually was on the cutting list of closing the school. And it does a brilliant job. So the change in principal to assistant principal was actually working the numbers backwards in order to get it to almost a break-even point, and it saved the school. If it has grown now and can carry its weight, then I would certainly be in favor of it being principal.
The difference in salary was 4,000 roughly, so you're between the current position, so that's how much the increase is. When you think about the enrollment growth and the potential to continue to grow the program, the 4,000 seemed insignificant.
Do they have the space?
Well, currently, no, they're using every space, so that would be a conversation as we grow the program. Right now, the Education Foundation is there,
Yeah.
and so we'll probably look to see if there's opportunities to relocate. We haven't had that conversation with them yet, so again, I'm telling all our stories here this morning.
Fruitland Park.
But
That's why I mentioned Fruitland Park.
but
Staldy said we need
the current administrator certainly has a vision to grow that program, and the capacity in working with the surrounding daycares and churches who also provide these types of services to some collaborative opportunities there as well.
Is
So
the concept to grow the pre-K program or the concept to grow like up to third and fourth?
I think our concept is to grow the early literacy program, to get kids in there, to make sure that they're ready for kindergarten, and they already run an early start program in the summer that we put there last year. So he did have kids on campus most of the summer. And so it would be, I think we want to grow the part of the initiative, one of the priorities that the superintendent brought in early on was to grow our early literacy programs, and that's a place that we could do that.
I think it's brilliant.
So the cost is only $4,000?
He's already at a 12-month assistant principalship because of the summer program, so he already went to that way. So it's almost virtually a title change. And you have to think about the idea, and just as a former principal, thinking about the idea when a parent comes in and they say, I want to talk to the principal, and you're like, well, I'm the assistant principal. Well, I want to talk to the principal, and you're like,
There is none.
but I'm it, so it's just an odd thing, to, like, your assistant to who? Well, I don't really know, but, so it's just, the whole thing doesn't allow somebody to say, I'm going to make this place something, and so, and again, I commend the current leader for not leaving last year. We did have some openings, and he did not apply to any of them. He had committed that he would grow this for us, and he committed that he would make it a place, but honestly,
I can say.
So are you going to move him the same person? Is this a human also change? That person's going to become a principal?
well, he's there as the assistant principal.
Is the idea to promote him? Because actually,
Yes.
he's very
Yes.
good.
He is.
Yes.
I was going to say, I don't know if everyone's had the opportunity to go there, but what was it, this past year that we went over there to do a reading?
That's right.
And it went over the intercom system and
Charlotte's Web.
everything. And just walking on that campus there, the atmosphere that you walked into, and how the kids were receptive and very acceptive of everything that was going on. I mean, it was just overwhelming. So I feel he's done it. The thing is, I agree with it. I'm asked Mr. Dodd if I could sit on this committee this year, or actually, I just told him I was going to sit on this committee this year.
I think
But
you just wrote it on the paper.
I think I mentioned it to you though. But I think this is great with what's going on here. Some of the history that I can remember, though, as far as the assistant principal, at one time, I know when Dr. Boone was there and when Kathy Ballar was there, at one time Charlie McDaniel was at Fruitland Park Elementary, and they answered to him. I'm like, that's a different campus. This campus, you buy into this campus. You don't buy into some other campus and they be over it. So that was who the principal was on record at that time, was at another campus. So I think this is a good move for no more cost than what it is, that it would be where this person buys into the program there, buys into the school, and it would grow. And a good opportunity would be when we build the Fruitland Park Elementary School at the new 20-acre site, that we take that existing building and we put our educational foundation there.
And while Well,
I'm glad you come up with that idea.
I did not. I did not put that on record. That was not me. And I will say this. I try not to make decisions or bring recommendations that have a person in mind. Well, I agree. I think the leader there is doing a fantastic job, and he certainly has risen to the challenge of what we have asked him to do. But when I looked at this particular change, I really want to look at it as it's the right change with the enrollment, no matter who's there or not. So I wanted to, right, I want to be clear about that I'm not changing this position for a person, because I think this document exceeds people, and we have to think about positions, and I know that's hard to separate the two, but I think it's important that we do that. And again, I think that the current leader there is doing fantastic, and certainly deserves this change in title. But when I think about the school itself, the enrollment that it has currently, and you look at some of our smaller schools, there are schools sitting with 427 and 2 admin, and so we have other schools that, and they certainly warrant a principal. So I just feel like at 3.0, he's grown it to the point he can't grow anymore unless we have to do something on our end. And so I feel like that it's, again, the whole leadership idea. I do want some consistency there, and I think that title change could help provide that, especially somebody who's interested in early literacy.
Yeah.
You already sold us.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Next. Do you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, I met with the previous principal when I first came on, and it was very odd, and you could tell that she, at the time, was a little disgruntled. You know, you're an AP, is the principal here? You know, like, it was, to me, it was confusing. It was confusing to her, and obviously that person's not in that position anymore.
But being fair, at that time, it saved that school from a board, from
A
an
completely
overwhelming
being
board
cut.
of cutting closing the school.
Right.
So the next change is on page 9 of the document. And this change is very small, but one of our goals was that we would have a document that was more accurate. And so these numbers that are changes that you see there within physical therapy and occupational therapy are numbers that actually represent more of what we serve currently. We've also made sure that our current caseload is somewhat in line with other districts in the state. So while we would love to have it at 30, the more realistic view is that currently we serve approximately 50 in elementary, in middle and high, and 60 for occupational therapy. So we just wanted those numbers to be more accurate to what the current status is.
Okay. How is the new restructuring of the gifted working? We had taken like 3 people and put them at the district level.
And they're on more consultative services. We still have gifted going on, but it's the middle school that's happening to. And I think what we find is it's a better use of the resource in terms of not having 2 kids at a school with 1 full allocation. So this way they're able to serve more kids throughout our district.
And
it's going pretty well. I mean,
working out.
we're definitely still working on the program and making sure those kids receive the exact right services for their needs. While that may be challenging education, it may be something else, but so we're still working through that. But I definitely think those allocations are serving more students throughout our district. So the last piece that we were talking about is on page 10, and so this change basically reflects 2 things. One, the ESOL teacher assistants, we lowered the threshold for receiving TA support. The first recommendation by the committee was to go up in 15 student increments, 15 with the same language, but I will be honest with you, we cannot afford that. And so I'm bringing back to you a recommendation that it goes, we did lower it by 15, so 2 for 50, 3 for 90. What happens in that, which is not reflected on this document, is that Title III funds the first one, and then the general fund funds the second one, and we kind of alternate back and forth to use some federal funds and some general funds until the federal funds run out. And so we do coordinate our funds to be able to do that, and we feel like this is a good solution. If you took the enrollment right now of our ELL students, this would add 4 allocations, 4 TA allocations, 2 paid for by Title III, 2 paid for by the general. So it's not a huge impact to our budgets, and certainly would provide people some support that they need.
What they need is 1 for 15.
Well, that's what they would, well, and it was, we brought that recommendation from our side, but, yeah, it would be great, like, you would go 2 for 30. It's just, it's a lot more than, than what we want, we feel like would be funded right now.
Is it highly, like, does the south end need it a lot more than the north end? Like, is the 1 for 15 reasonable? Like, what I
Yes.
mean is like,
And these are
like,
same
if there's very
language.
few children at Eustis, but a lot of kids at Sawgrass, do we need to have the threshold for 1 be higher so that Sawgrass would have more? So that then there'd be a smaller,
So that's kind of how it works. So basically,
everybody gets 1, right?
if they get 15 students.
So doesn't most every school have 15
No,
students?
every student doesn't. But the same language.
Oh, it's the same language. Okay.
So it adds, and where this is gonna benefit the most is probably East Ridge High. Because they have a large amount, and Sawgrass as well. So those 2 schools was where this, and I think that, their principal sits on this committee, and she did not bring the recommendation, but she did say that they needed some support down there. I don't know if you remember her saying that there was. So this, we sent this back out to them to say, would this be okay for now? And they agreed that it would be okay. The other
Probably
thing-
not very reluctantly, agreeing, but they would, because
Yeah.
they like the 1 to 15, 2 to 30, and, yeah.
So we're gonna continue to try to work towards that, but right now I think this will suffice. If we see a lot of growing numbers, we may have to bring something back to you because we do know those students do need our support. Also, we deleted the ESOL resource teacher, mostly because nobody reached that threshold this year, and it was just, we didn't need it. We didn't allocate it out, it didn't happen, so we thought we would just wait. Nobody reached that level, so we felt like it wasn't needed at this time. It's always something we can add later if it comes to a point where we get to that level. Also, you'll notice in the middle, with psychologists, social workers, and nurses, I highlighted, I hope yours are highlighted kind of in an orange color so, and all that is telling you is those are allocations that are going to be done based on our millage. And so we didn't need that language anymore. So with the millage funding, we will have 1 per every 2 schools for psychologists and social workers, and then a school-based nurse at every school. So that was something you've already approved with the millage plan that Dr. Landry and Mr. Ward presented to you earlier in this year. And that is really all that I have at this time. If you have any questions or any other comments about the document.
How is food service going? Because there was a big discussion. So I'll be so tell me, how's food service going?
I'd rather not say it this time.
Okay, I'll let it go.
So, although food service is not my area of expertise, as you well know, I will remind you, I did do a little bit of work on that on December 10th, we put the food service allocations back from the staffing plan to this allocation plan. It was something that you approved back then. That's why they're included in this document again. And that there was a comment made that the food service department would present some findings and a redesign plan for your consideration at a board workshop in early spring of 2019. So I think that's an up and coming.
Okay.
Maybe discussion?
I'd like to ask about all the various forecasts of charts of enrollment, and so that's our best picture guess of which category schools will fall into next year. Looks like there's about 8 schools that we predict that are going to increase in enrollment that will put them into the next threshold of either gaining another assistant principal or.
So actually, so this is actually this year's enrollment. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, I think I'm right? So we don't
Okay.
move schools over until you approve this document. So what you see in red is where they would be in 18-19. So we're not projecting any, this is actually pretty current.
Okay, so all those greens, that's where they ended up this year. Okay, so we really increased like 8 assistant principals this year,
Well, so,
right?
I'm pretty frugal. So we haven't exactly doled all of them out yet.
Okay.
So we're making that work currently.
Okay.
We have discussions, so I know that's a threshold, but we do look to see, like, if when you're talking a couple, it just depends on the enrollment, really,
Okay.
right?
So the other question I've got, as I look specifically about Sawgrass Bay now, they're in a chart they've always been in a column completely of their own, but it seems like they're moving farther and farther down the side to having, I don't know, maybe something in the margin over here because of their growing enrollment. And I also know the math of, you've got to have so many places for kids to go during enrichment time. Are we seeing large enrichment size classes there?
I guess the question would be how large?
Because I know from my experience teaching at Grassy Lake, there were, for instance, if we had 10 classes that had to go to enrichment at a time, but we only had 8 places for them to go, obviously some classes would result in splitters. You might end up with 30 kids or 35 kids in an art class or a tech lab where you only have so many computers, that kind of thing. Now, in some enrichments, it's fine, right? You walk into a music room, that's great, assuming you've got enough equipment for these people, right? But,
It's
is
one
that
school
happening there?
sometimes I do hear from Grassy Lake, as you will know.
Sure.
But I actually have not, Sawgrass Bay has not expressed a concern about having too large of enrichment
Okay.
classes. So I'll be honest, it's not one of the things that I often go down and look at when I'm at schools. So I'm looking more at the academics and the core areas. But it's certainly something I can check into to see if there's some support there. They do have other funding like title and some things to work through. So I don't know if they're using some of those allocations to alleviate. But at this time, she's not talked to me at all about having.
Okay, all right.
Do they need 4 assistant principals? It just seems like, generally aren't assistant principals dealing with disciplinary issues?
No,
Those two things.
no, that's one of the things they certainly deal with, absolutely, yes. But thinking about, the expectations now are certainly that assistant principals are being groomed to be leaders, and so they are doing a lot of what the job of a leader does. So they have instructional responsibilities, they have evaluations. Think about the idea of how many staff members you have to divide that up. So they're in walkthroughs, they're leading training, they're leading collaborative planning time, so there's a lot of responsibilities on them as well. I would certainly say that's a place that helps. They currently are operating with 3 assistant principals, and so we'll kind of see how that is. So far, they're okay. But they certainly do qualify for one. I need to check their numbers exactly to make sure that, if it's 351, then we're going to hold up for a while.
Somebody might move. They might leave. The other question I've got, and I'll preface this with, once again, the huge kudos to eliminating the small school disadvantage that existed, right? When you ended up with 600 kids, you basically had PE and maybe one other enrichment. And certainly we have a lot of value and see a lot of value in the music and art being in all of our elementary schools, and that's a great source of pride every time we can go out there and say that. The question for me is whether or not we've done art a good service in giving you the option of art or STEAM. And where I ask this question is, what sort of monitoring are we doing to know that anybody with a STEAM lab is actually doing any art? Because I think I can probably point to a couple programs where there really is no art, but they call it STEAM. So that's one where on paper it says it, but I just don't know how you enforce it. It's an enrichment, kids aren't graded, we don't know that art's actually happening.
But even at the competition, that every
There's no
booth,
art in that competition.
Every booth I went to, the kids had drawn stuff. Every single one.
You mean
I was
like
an
a
engineer.
graph?
I'm talking about at the fair,
Oh,
at the competition,
the science fair?
science fair.
But that doesn't, there were 200 projects out of 42,000 kids at that.
I'm just saying
Fair.
that STEAM, that the science and technology has an element of art built into it.
Right.
Kids are drawing.
But my question is, in the STEAM class, are they actually doing any art? Because I'll argue with you that there are some schools where they're calling it STEAM, but there's no art actually happening. That's the point I'm making, where I'm not sure that they're in the same, because it all goes back to, if I didn't have to trade that discretionary allocation for a CRT, I'd have my tech lab again, or that's where the kids are doing the engineering and the science. But they're not doing that because they're saying, oh, well, we're going to combine all the science with art, and we're going to call it STEAM, and depending on who I plug in there, that's what they're going to do. So art's not happening in some of those labs.
That's true.
So if I can recall, there's only 2 that have STEAM. So, and I know that one of them, I've had some conversation with that individual, and I saw a good integration of art into that. Now, the other one I have not been in, but so we're only talking about two schools, one that I can attest to the fact that I have seen the integration of art, the other one I have not, but I haven't looked for it either. So that would be something that I'd be happy to look to see whether or not that's happening.
So we've only got 2 who picked STEAM, the other 18 picked art.
That's correct.
Okay. And perhaps it's not as widespread of an issue, but. And if,
I
sounds like
mean,
you've already
I think
addressed.
we knew that was gonna happen when we agreed to
Oh,
STEAM.
yeah. Yeah.
You know,
absolutely.
like,
And I know given our budget woes, it's probably not the time to be asking for stuff, but if we've identified that 3/4 of our schools have said, I need to trade away an enriching program for students so I can have somebody else on my staff, basically administratively to do tasks, then at what point do we just fund that for them and say, stop taking away the kids' opportunities because you need somebody to check off volunteers in your system and be textbook operators and that kind of stuff, not actually, right? Because we said there were 16 CRTs, so 14 CRTs, that's like 3/4. So 3/4 of the school are, right? I mean, they're saying, instead of having another opportunity for students, another enriching opportunity for students, I need an extra person to do this, all these various administrative tasks. At what point do we say, yeah, I guess you need the position after all?
So I don't want to paint a broad brush with their responsibilities. I think last year really dove into their
Sure.
responsibilities,
Oh,
right?
I
So I
definitely
don't want,
know
and
what they
I
do.
also don't want to diminish that they only check in volunteers and do textbook work. I think that would be a misconception on many, many cases. While I had to do my own research, remember last year, on exactly what their intentional purpose was and they do have a vast majority of responsibilities when we looked at that job
Yes,
description last
that's
year.
my argument too.
Well, here's what I'm finding, is that many cases, they do have some of those responsibilities. There are some places where the responsibilities have some managerial pieces to it. I also know that many times you will find these people, they do work with small groups. And so I think when we talk about not taking away something from kids, sometimes this is a position that allows for a lot of intervention pieces to work. So many of these people actually pull some small groups of students to do some interventions with. I know many CRTs have at least 1 or 2 groups a day that they pull and work with on intervention. So that's a place that I know that some of them are doing that work. I guess, Mark, I think what you're asking me for, which I'd be happy to do, is to go out and look to see sort of what is the real day-to-day work that they're doing. I don't know that will take the place of the document. I think one of the things that I appreciate about this for leaders is they do get to make some decisions. This document at sometimes is pretty restrictive into how they can use people and what they get. And this is one opportunity for them to make some decisions based on their school needs. So while maybe we don't sit on the same side in terms of this, I'd be happy to at least look at what the actual qualification,
Well,
or what
I
they're
hope-
actually doing in schools each day.
Well, I think somewhere there must be some sort of disconnect, because I'm arguing in favor of the CRT position, because I know the work that they do, and I know
okay. I
know
thought you
how
were
vast
arguing
the
in the
responsibilities
other
are.
place.
But
Okay.
so that's why I'm saying, at what point do we just fund this as a district, rather than saying, instead of providing this opportunity for your students, you can now have this person to go do all these other things, and we're taking away an art, or we're taking away a science lab, or we're taking away a potential aviation elective. We're taking away all of those things, so that way this person can just go do all the things that you described, that we just described were so critical to the function of an elementary school, that 3/4 of the schools are finding that they need this position. And I guess I'd wager, if you've only got one assistant principal, you definitely need this position. You don't have a prayer of figuring out how to get all this done without it. So those are the schools that are losing an extra enrichment opportunity, because they need to pull this person to be a CRT rather than be an art teacher.
but are they choosing to have the STEM?
They are, but then they're not necessarily
Is it-
doing art.
But I mean, but is the solution to add 6 CRTs, or is it to mandate art instead of STEM for 2 schools? I mean, if art is the actual priority.
But it's not about art for these two. It's art for these 2 schools, but then it's also a science enrichment opportunity for these other 16 schools or 14 schools. Everybody's trading something. Everybody who's got a CRT has given something up for students in order to have the CRT position. And maybe there are a couple of CRTs out there doing interventions, but I guess I'm finding it hard to convince me that that's the widespread norm. And if it is, then that shows you even more how valuable that we need to just be budgeting this position across the district rather than saying, take a teacher off the front lines with students so that way you can accomplish these tasks. We know how
So you'd
critical
be
they are.
putting back in the budget 21 CRTs.
Yes, and that's the challenge, the dilemma, because there is no money for that. I get that, but
It was a nice conversation.
yeah. So
And I don't think that people are not dissatisfied with what they have currently. I mean, I think you would find that leaders are doing okay. I think we made some hard decisions last year. So I think we made some tough decisions last year. We took them off the line item and we put them as a discretionary. And I think leaders have worked that out. I don't have people necessarily coming to me and saying, I need both, or they've been able to work out this idea of using this one discretionary in a way that they saw their school needed it. So, I mean, I'm willing to do whatever. I can take back to the committee, whatever you want. I just know that it is almost it's a little over $1 million expense.
yeah, I know there's not $1 million here. I guess I just want us to come to terms and say, long term, we need to figure out how to put this thing back into the budget because it's what people need to function. And then no longer would the student experience be sacrificed because of the tasks that need to be performed.
I guess I don't understand what experience, if they're managing to have, to have these three things, PE, STEAM, or basically art or STEM, so we'll just say what it is. It's PE, art or STEM, and music. And at two schools, they don't have art, they have STEM instead. Is that really, I mean, we had a big conversation about this last year, is that really like the cross to die on? Because they're the ones that need or feel like they need this extra overhead person. The kids are still getting PE, art or STEM, and music at like our smallest schools.
Yeah, because but we've locked them into no flexibility. So if you want
I don't
something
know
unique,
if we don't have the funds to be flexible.
That's where I'm just arguing for the long term, that we just come to terms and say, because last year there was so much discussion in rigmarole about how unessential the CRT position was, and it was rather insulting. I mean, I was making the arguments that you were making just now, and nobody was listening. And that's just problematic to me. So, I mean, just come to terms that, yes, these people do functions that are imperative, and at some point, we as a district need to fund it. That's where I'm asking.
I don't think anybody was saying that they weren't important.
That was
Last
the
year,
term when
last year we were
everybody
looking
would say
at, we had to make cuts, and that these were difficult
Well,
times
we need to go
make these
back and watch
cuts.
that tape, because a good portion of that discussion centered around is whether or not we should even give them an option to be a CRT, because we were like,
We did
what do
have
they
that.
do? They do nothing.
Yeah, we did have that.
Yeah.
We did.
And so we came to terms and said, okay, if you find it so valuable, then go ahead and use this. And we thought maybe a handful of schools would have to fall back on the CRT, that because most people, we had this whole list and said, well, actually, an administrator does most of these things in other districts, so why do we have the CRT doing it? Well, because then you end up with this whole pile of elementary schools that have one assistant principal. They can't take on that kind of workload, right? So they'll never be available to be in a teacher's classroom with if we put all the tasks of the CRT on them, or we would dump all those things back onto a teacher who already is at their max, and then they would have no additional stipend for doing all this additional work. So now they lose all their planning and after-school experiences.
But we gave them that discretionary allocation that they could choose a CRT, and 14 did, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes,
So
and
they
they
made
said-
their own decision for their own school.
Because they had to. Because they
Well,
had to do
sometimes you
because
have
nobody
to
else
make
would do the work.
decisions. But how about we just put this in place like last year, and this is the second year?
Right, so
Then
I
we
don't
just
know
kinda
that,
see
I
if
don't
there's
know
a problem
what will
with it
happen
going
this year,
forward.
but they'll still keep it the same, and we haven't had that discussion yet, because this is the first document that has to go before everybody, so I don't know what people will choose. I just know from last year, 14 chose, so I think that's a number to bring back to you to say how many.
I think it's good to let it run another year.
You've got 6 that are using it for, science and other things that, where you have someone directly working with kids. And I think that one of the things that, as we're now in the middle of our mid-year data meetings with each principal, and we talk about the small group instruction, some of the, how we're getting these folks closer to kids. So I think that that's one of the things that they know is our vision and expectation, that we move them closer to kids, especially this time of year. So we're seeing and having more conversation about using them, while they are assisting maybe with some administrative duties. I do think that we are pushing them closer to kids, which is where we would like for them ultimately to be. So do agree with the flexibility does seem to be working.
And one of the conversations I think that we had coming out of the allocations last year, the grander vision was that there was going to be greater flexibility, and here's a whole menu of different positions that you would eventually be able to pick from. So you might not, because right now you're choosing between either I'm going to have a CRT or I'm going to have somebody teaching kids, right? And so where is that in the grander scheme?
So we've done some work on that. I put it on hold for a little bit. I've really kind of wanted to see that this played out a little bit longer. It's what I know, when we made the changes last year, it seemed to have a huge financial benefit. That system that the consultant from FAS was working with our group on, it doesn't necessarily have benefits yet for financial reasons, and there was a lot of work being done in other areas right now, and so that was a large overhaul in terms of what that would look like. And I felt like one more year of waiting to see how this played out would kind of help me see if that's a place we want to go. The cost savings to that is sort of happens years down the road as people leave or retire. Then sometimes people can trade it in for something else. It's kind of a trade-in system. It's based on points. And it actually doesn't deal with basic allocations. It actually deals with everybody else who's non-load bearing.
Yes, yes.
And so it is something to look at. It just, I didn't feel like it was as huge of a benefit to do it this year. It's almost like timing is everything, and I wasn't really ready to take on that timing this year. But we're still looking at that. We've met a couple times this year to kind of see how we might play that out, but it's a big change, and I feel like we had a big change last year, and I kind of want to watch this work for a few years before, I don't want to move too fast.
Okay. Well, I certainly encourage the continued exploration of that kind of thing, where you're deciding between what sort of non-load-bearing positions you're picking from versus I'm going to either have this load-bearing position or I'm going to pull it away from kids and have it do these other tasks instead. And
there was a lot of education that has to happen with that particular system, and right now, and school leaders have to make a large amount of that piece of it. So I felt like
I accidentally hit mine. I closed it out.
I felt like right now leaders are working on a few other things, that the implementation of an intervention and acceleration block. We're still working on a lot of things for the Common Vision. We have Chromebook implementation. We have Performance Matters. So yeah, for now, right? So it was a lot, honestly, Mark, that I felt like it wasn't going to hurt us one more year.
That's
the
fine.
First year you do it, you basically keep everybody the same and just assign them a point. So it really takes people to leave before you can start making trades, and it was just a timing thing for me.
that's fine. I just want to.
We're overhauling every board policy that we have. I mean, there's just a lot going on. So
I was just making sure y'all hadn't given up.
we have
hope
not
on that.
given up
Okay.
on it.
And the one more question I have too is that I think a lot of this savings resulted because we were then able to, instead of using the individual class sizes as the parameters for meeting the law, but then go to some averages.
Yes.
How did that shake out? Did we end up with classes where you had 24, 25 kids in a 22 or an 18 limit?
Mr. Ward? No, our class size average is coming out pretty well.
Okay.
There are some that are a little higher, but no. In fact, I'm collecting class sizes right now to prepare for the allocation kind of rollout to see if I need to make some adjustments. We just got a class size report. Of course, we came in fine and under, because you can use other teachers to do that average. So we sit pretty good. So we did not overcrowd too much. And there are maybe a few that are at 24, 25, but not many. It certainly is not widespread.
Okay.
We probably still have some adjustments we can make based on enrollment and get a little bit skinnier.
What do you mean we can use other teachers? You mean
So for
like
class size average, you can actually use your ESE teachers as part of the average. So when you do your K-3 averages, you can use a class.
How big are our classes then?
They're still, that's what he's asking. They still come well within the 17, 18.
The actual kids' butts and
Yes.
seats.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
So
I
even
think
though
our
we're-
average was like 16.1 was the average for K3, so I mean, we're still under.
Good shape.
I mean, but if you have 8, don't we have certain schools that have a whole bunch of ESE classrooms?
We do.
Eustis Heights.
Right, like Beverly Shores, I think, is another
But
hub.
Eustis Heights classrooms, it's themselves, still are doing fine in terms of being at 17, 18 in K3, some maybe 19. They may have a grade level that might be a little higher, but they have another grade level that's lower, so.
Previously, that 19 would have triggered a class size violation, but now,
That's correct.
because we have this other teacher that we're allowed to start using in the average, that doesn't.
And are we watching the, like, kindergarten should be smaller, like a third grade classroom is night and day. I mean, I know you know, from a kindergarten classroom, I mean, they really do need smaller numbers than.
Sometimes people make so I'm collecting all those numbers as we speak. Every time we meet with somebody, they bring me their numbers, so I'm looking at that to make sure that we're okay, but I think leaders know to make those types of decisions, and sometimes we have, maybe a year it's high, and then the next year it's gonna be lower, but the averages do help us with not adding allocations based on that one number coming over.
I said one more question, but really, there's one that comes up every single year, and that's about PE class sizes. Where we find that half of the grade levels out there at a time, under the supervision of maybe one or two adults. Have we gotten any sort of guidance or parameters on how many kids should be out there with an adult, and whether you can use, I guess, teacher assistants to help?
We allocate extra TAs based on those numbers, so that's, I think, on page 3, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And we do add those, and again, I think people are,
I mean, do we still have potentially a PE teacher out there with 100 kids?
no.
Because we had that.
I think because we have the TA out there, we do not have that situation anymore. I mean, I think we have some instances where people have called in, but I have had nobody call in this year. I think part of it is because of some of these allocations with the art, music, PE. We've had an opportunity, art, music, and with discretionary and the STEAM. I think that it's helped a little bit with that. And then we still add TAs when they need it. So I think I haven't gotten any calls about that.
Because ultimately, we did add a position last year, right? Most had a CRT that was mandated, but they only then had PE and art or music. And ultimately, we did add
But no, it
a
depends
person.
on what threshold you were at. So if you were at the 600 school, or 0 to 699, you gained a person, but if you were like in the 1,000 to 1,200, I think you lost somebody when you ended up then using one of your enrichment allocations to be a CRT.
That happened. That was very few cases. We did have that chart, didn't we? Where we looked at that to see who would gain and who would lose.
Yeah,
I
there were a
think it
couple
was
who
one
lost.
or two that actually
It was-
lost, and
yeah,
I
it was
think we
one.
ended up kind of working with them, so I don't know that anybody lost anything.
I don't think so.
I think it was anybody on the higher end of that. So Sawgrass Bay, Grassy Lake, Lost Lake, didn't they all lose?
I don't believe so. I'll go back and verify that, but I think we worked with them to make sure that,
They were okay. I don't think so.
I think one of them had a science that we ended up actually adding that science back. I think that was at Grassy Lake.
I don't know. I'd have to check. I don't have that
I'm
folder with me.
confident they're
but-
down one. I'm confident they're down one.
At Grassy Lake.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
I don't know
Sawgrass
if
Bay, I remember last year when I was fighting so hard, they came to me and said,
I can
"We'll-
check.
we'll be okay." But yes, they were supposed to lose one as well.
We'll verify that.
All right, anything else? You sir? Thank you, Dr. Trent.
All right, thank you.
I almost called you Dr. Transformation. It's been that long of a morning. All right, our internal audit plan, Mr. Tom Mock, the director of our internal audit.
Thank you. Real quick, a few weeks back, I found out that the FTE auditor was coming in to do an audit. I think Scott Ward has already mentioned that. Last audit, I was under the impression that they were going to go back to their 3-year cycle instead of this every other year cycle. So it seems like we're still on the every other year cycle. So it doesn't seem, at least, but I'm looking at an audit, if somebody else is auditing that area or was just there, there's no sense of me doing it because it's just duplication of efforts. So I was supposed to start today working on the FTE audit. We have the state auditor here, so I felt it would be better if we replace that audit with something else. I gave on the next page, I talked with each of you individually to try to solicit an idea that maybe was on your mind of an area that recently came up that maybe could use some audit resources on. May have actually heard one today here in insurance, but I basically had one input from y'all, and that was in the food service area, looking at that potentially like the charter schools where there are services that the district is providing in food services where we're not recouping or benefiting. You know, we're spending dollars as a district where food services should be spending those dollars. So that would be the focus of the audit, if you choose to do that one. I then, since I didn't have anything else, I went back and went to other school districts on the websites and through notes that I was taking, just kind of look at what they were doing and kind of jotted down what was coming up. They do, a lot of them do property control audits. I didn't have them here in any order. And then recently I noticed 2 districts were doing something in the athletics area. So I don't have audit programs for each of those, but I could reach out and talk to them to see if they're willing to lend me their audit programs in those areas and work with them to come up with, you know, how to look at those areas. The other one is, I just heard today, or if there's anything else that maybe is on your mind or on the superintendent's mind that we could substitute in the FTE audit for something.
What would property control look like?
In my mind, probably be looking at, one of the things to be looking at is all the excess property that we're storing and, you know, how are we doing in disposing of that and hopefully recouping some dollars from it. And then the other is just to look at our policies and procedures that we're using in property controls and making sure that we're adhering to those throughout the district.
You're talking about equipment,
Correct.
not land.
Oh, I thought you were talking about land.
Idle. No. We're looking at desk chairs,
That's-
anything
I wanna
over
make sure
$1,000
that
bucks.
y'all were in-
Thank you.
Anything over $1,000.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, no, I'm not looking at the land.
And
Because
what
we're
was
not
the
planning on
athletics?
getting into that.
What was that about?
I don't know. I mean, it came up on a couple. My assumption would be looking at the activities and where the money's being spent and how it's being spent. I didn't do much research into that one. I saw it like 2 to 3 times in a couple of the school districts like Orange County, Escambia County, and I think there was one down south in Dade or something like that. So.
And then go through the food service again? What you'd be looking for?
The discussion I had with, was to look at areas in food services where the district is spending money and we could actually move that over to food services. So
I'd
the
go with that
district
one.
would save money,
I had actually,
obviously.
I was one, I think that recommended that one.
Yes.
And I had, the idea is like the custodians, for example. You know, if they're working X number of hours in the cafeteria, we know that food service has a huge excess in funding, and then we could actually have their salary come from that money.
And we have to look at the guidelines for that too, because I learned through talking with some other folks, there are guidelines.
Yeah.
In other words, they just can't come in and work for an hour, and then we charge that hour, you know, there has to be a certain amount of time, so. And then looking at, you know, make sure energy-wise, you know, are we allotting the
Right. Well,
proper
and you know
square
how much
footage
kitchens,
and dollars?
electricity kitchens use up.
Or should we meter some of them separately? You know, just looking at all the different variables. So I just kind of need a consensus that which one I should go for, and then I will update the audit plan and have it on the
Oh, so that was
agenda.
left blank on purpose. I
Yeah,
didn't
it was
know
left
if
blank to
okay.
fill in, because I will fill that in, and then this will go before you
Okay.
next Monday, right? You
Thought
have a
maybe
board
it
meeting
was just a
next Monday
typo.
for final approval, before I can move forward,
I
so.
like that one.
Time is of the essence, in other words.
Everybody, we can't vote.
No, you can't vote, but I can just, do you have consensus?
No, we can't do that either.
You can't have consensus?
I think he knows which
For
one to
me to
write
move
down and
forward?
propose for Monday.
How do I know which one to choose?
Food service is great. So he just has to write.
Well, I can tell you, you had
Can
3
I,
people
can I poll
say-
each one?
No, you can't do that either.
How do
Please.
how do
I think you
which
probably
one?
know which one to write down and propose for Monday.
Yeah. It has to be on an agenda item for us to vote on it, or
I'm not
give you a
asking about-
consensus, or give a consensus, or anything of that nature there. No,
No.
no.
You know which one to write down. Move on.
You already, yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate your time today.
All righty. All right, that was the shortest presentation of the morning, going into the afternoon. All right. Board member comments.
I'm good.
Mr. Dye?
I'll defer till general meeting.
Yeah, I'm good too.
All right. I just want to, I'll forget. So science fair was great. All the kids that participated, it was great. And hats off to all the staff that were involved putting it together and made it happen. And also to people that may not have been there Friday night, Mount Dora First Baptist Church donated that facility at no cost.
Amazing.
So hats off to them. We appreciate that. Also, for any future, if you're planning on me being somewhere, if you email me, please attach that to Patty, and she takes care of my calendar because I failed to be there Thursday night for the award ceremony, and I appreciate Stephanie stuffing in. I hope she didn't get sick because of that, but I appreciate her being there. But it was actually, I was in another area taking care of a situation with some families that had lost a loved one, so I appreciate her doing that for me, though. All right, Superintendent?
I'm good.
Attorney? We're adjourned.